Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Now, settle in and journey back to the Old West, where love, courage, and second chances are waiting to be found. Copyright Indiana Wake. Her Fight for Love by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. It's still a good job, honey. There aren't many young ladies who can say that they're reporters, Charlotte Martin said brightly, trying to lift her youngest daughter's spirits. And it is only your second week. Ma, I am one of the young ladies who could not say she's a reporter. How does a cookery column somewhere near the back of the county newspaper make me a reporter? I can't even cook, as you well know. Cathy Meadows sighed loudly. Nobody needs to know that, Cathy. In fact, if you want my advice, I wouldn't go mentioning any of your culinary disasters down at the newspaper office. Charlotte was unable to hide her amusement. Hearty ha ha ha, Ma, Cathy said, grinning broadly. Her mother always made her laugh. I know it's not what you wanted, Charlotte said as she put 2 mugs of coffee down on the kitchen table and took a seat opposite her daughter. I know you're real disappointed, but you have to start somewhere. But why? I mean, there's men in that office, junior reporters like me, and not one of them had to start out doing nothing more than writing down recipes sent in by ladies all around Colorado. So why should I? I know it's not fair, Cathy. I know it's not right. And I know it's not good enough to say it's just the way things are. Believe me, when 2 of my girls saved their daddy's ranch by being as good as the men, it makes my blood boil to know that, 18 years later, this nonsense still exists. But honey, my boiling blood isn't going to help you. My advice just might. And what's your advice? Cathy asked a little sullenly before taking a sip of the scalding hot coffee and opening her eyes wide in surprise. Oh, that's hot. It's coffee. It's meant to be hot. You weren't kidding about being no good in the kitchen, Charlotte chuckled. My advice is to wait for your opportunity. If you just wait for it, keep your eyes open for it, it'll come, she said and held out a hand when it seemed her daughter was about to interrupt. You're the best writer I know. Heavens, you've been reporting on Wild Meadow Ranch since you were old enough to read and write. A talent like yours won't go to waste, I promise. As hard as it is, you just have to be patient and focus on opportunity. The Lord will send it if you have faith. Don't spend all your time wondering why life isn't fair for all folks, it won't help. I know it's hard, but don't waste your energy. Use it to find the opportunity. I know it will come. Thanks, Ma. I reckon there's no harm in trying. Although, I don't think I'll wait for my opportunity to come from Mr. Alexander, she said and screwed up her face. No, maybe not. John Alexander was the deputy editor of the local branch office of the Colorado Tribune, a newspaper which had been in decline for some years. A year before, the owner had decided to open up smaller offices in strategic locations all around Colorado, adding something of a local feel in the hope it would get the dwindling reader numbers back up again. And the plan had worked, for numbers certainly were looking promising again. It seemed like folks wanted to find a little something about their hometown once in a while, even if it was only on page 5. Prior to that, most stories were centered around the larger towns of Denver, Boulder, or Aspen. To hear a little something from places like Grafton Crest and Mayfield gave the newspaper a kind of personal touch. But when she'd done everything in her power to show off her considerable skills, it sure had irked her to be rather grandly told that she would be the only culinary columnist for all of Colorado. John Alexander had smiled down at her like he might smile at a child to whom he was giving a piece of candy to keep them quiet. Before that moment, Cathy, despite her intelligence, had never realized just how things were out there in the world. Maybe because her own sisters had never been so belittled, Cathy had assumed that was the way of things. Why on earth did newspaper men think writing was so much harder than chasing cattle at breakneck speed on horseback? Not that Cathy had ever done that, but she'd seen her sister, Elsie, do it on a daily basis. She still did, and she was 35 with 2 children. What did John Alexander know, huh? He's not all bad, she conceded quietly. I mean, he's kind of sweet and kind of funny. I just wish I could have been interviewed by Russell Tapper. I might have made him see how much more I could be doing. What's he like, this Russell Tapper? I don't know, Ma. I only got to speak to him once when he was on his way from his office to head out somewhere. Mr. Alexander just hurriedly told him that I'm the new girl. Yes, he did say girl, and he just said it was nice to meet me and kept moving. So, why do you think you'd have got on any better with him than John Alexander? Her mother looked perplexed. He's going to have seen women in the office before. I mean, it won't be new to him, will it? Not coming from New York and all. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily follow, honey. Charlotte looked dubious. Just remember, the Claytons came in from New York, and the head of that household isn't a particularly fair man. I know. I just mean that Mr. Tapper has more experience, I'm sure of it. He's not a young man, and I reckon he'll have been in the business a while. Goodness, how old is he? I heard one of the typists saying she'd heard he was 32 or 3. And he can still walk? Charlotte burst out laughing. Honey, your sisters are older than that. I know, Ma. What I mean is, he's old enough to have good experiences under his belt from working in New York. Maybe he would care more about the paper doing well than the fact that one of his reporters is wearing a dress is all. To get where he is, he can't be dumb. He might have been able to see past the nonsense and actually take the time to find out what I'm really good at and use it to his advantage. It's in his best interests to send great stories to the main newspaper office in Denver and put this part of Colorado on the map, after all. What you say makes sense, Cathy. And I sure do hope it works out that way. I reckon I just don't want you to be disappointed is all, so please don't go pinning all your hopes on this Russell Tapper. Don't worry, Ma, I won't. I'll just put your advice into action. That's my girl. You wait and see, some big story might come your way when you least expect it. Yes, it just might, Cathy said, and she sounded more enthusiastic than she felt. What chance did she really have of stumbling across a big story in Grafton Crest? While out looking for recipe ideas from the local ladies to boot? No, she doubted it very much. Not only that, but Grafton Crest was the kind of place that was short on stories. If something big broke and she was there to see it, she could well imagine all her hard work being taken off her the minute she walked back in through the newspaper office door. She could picture John relieving her of her notebook and handing it to one of his favorites to write up and put his name on. And now she was doing the very thing she'd been against. She was putting all her energy into thinking about the unfairness of it all instead of just being determined to keep her eyes and ears open for that story her ma had promised her would come one day. Perhaps her mother was right, for the little scenario she had played out in her head had certainly exhausted her. She felt jaded already, just 2 weeks into the job she had waited her whole life for. This was no way to start, and she knew it. But how was she going to keep sane just wandering around the town interviewing folk about the best stew they'd ever tasted? What on earth did she know about stew? Or bread, Or biscuits for that matter. Nothing, that was what. It seemed like she was going to have to strive just to keep the tiny foothold she had, maybe even learn a little something about cooking after all. The very thought made her shudder visibly, and her mother eyed her curiously. "Are you all right, honey?" "Yes, I am. I was just wondering what delights tomorrow's assignment is going to bring me." Chapter 2. Russell Tapper liked his office far more than he had expected to. He had imagined the branch office at Grafton Crest to be a kind of naive affair, even if it was a brand new building with reporters moving in from out of town to help run it. Leaving home had certainly been a wrench, and he'd been pleasantly surprised to find the building and its staff to be every bit as competent as anything in New York. Sure, the building was small, as was the staff, but it was a professional setup and one he'd been glad to take over in its first year. His office was right in the middle of the room, with windows on all sides so that he could peer out at the workforce, and blinds in every window that he could turn to block everything out. The reporters' desks were neatly lined about the place, and there was a bank of desks at which 4 typists sat poised, ready to type up everything deemed good enough to send to the overall editor at the main office in Denver. So far, everything he'd sent had gone into print somewhere in the Colorado Tribune, and he'd been proud of the achievement. And it sure was an achievement in a town like Grafton Crest. There were plenty of other towns nearby, but they all had a kind of sleepy feel to them. Maybe that was why the staff seemed so impressive. It wasn't as easy here to write a good story as it was in New York, where there was so much going on that a reporter had their pick. Here, it had to be worked at, and his new colleagues sure did work at it. He was enjoying today. There was no special reason for it, and he knew it wouldn't last. Each day was a coin toss. Would he feel optimistic, or would he just go through the motions and wait out the day, all the while dreaming of going back to New York, his strategic and temporary move west finally reaping its own rewards? And it really had been a strategic move, like tin soldiers on a map. Russell had long since come to realize that he would not get where he wanted to go in the New York newspaper business without something else to recommend him, something which would make him stand out. It wasn't just that there was too much competition in New York, but the cold hard fact that connections always won out over the achievement. Russell had been raised in a family without those sorts of connections. He was the first in his family to branch out into an occupation that went beyond the practical and utilitarian. What's more, he had broken out into that world with every expectation that it would greet him with open arms. He was clever, after all, and he knew that his own tenacious investigative reporting and engaging style of writing were second to none. To realize that it counted for nothing, in the end, had been the hardest of blows. Worse still, it was something that he had stoically refused to recognize for many years in the industry. All the time, he kept pushing on, not coming to his final conclusion until he had turned 30 years old. It was then that he had decided to look elsewhere, to find a place where he would be accepted as an editor at last, if only to hold that job for a year or so before returning home and trying his luck once again. After all, once he had been an editor, surely that would count for something. The blinds on the windows were neither entirely open nor entirely closed, just as Russell liked it. It meant that he could surreptitiously peer out at his workforce now and again without them feeling pressurized by it. And he felt sure it had to be better for them to be able to get on with their work without the idea that the boss was keeping a fine eye on them from his unobstructed windows. Russell's mental wanderings were curtailed when he caught sight of the newest member of the team. Her name was Cathy Meadows, and his deputy editor had just employed her as the culinary columnist. The fact that the woman had not smiled once in her few weeks on the paper had spoken volumes of what she thought of being handed such a task. As if on cue, John Alexander walked past the young woman's desk, and Russell laughed out loud to see the look on her face. It was the sort of look which said that she couldn't quite believe what had happened, a look of the purest exasperation. Alexander seemed oblivious, and Russell was beginning to see that that was a fairly ordinary state of being for the man. He was clever, that was certain, and he could sure pick out the best of the stories for submission to the main office. But there was something about John, something almost blundering, even endearing, like a dog who had once been a phenomenal bloodhound but who preferred, these days, to stretch out on the porch in the sunshine and think about what had once been. As John walked across the office, Russell could see Cathy Meadows following his progress with a vaguely irritated expression, and he laughed again. She was young and very beautiful, and he could see her struggling to hide her own feelings. The truth was, he didn't blame her. It was a terrible assumption, in Russell's opinion, that the only job that could be offered her was a sort of literary regurgitation of other people's recipes. Of course, it was an assumption he'd seen made everywhere, even in New York. Perhaps to a lesser degree, but still, it was there. It was a sense of unfairness that Russell identified with. Perhaps it was easier for him to understand that young woman's unspoken frustration because it was something that he'd felt himself. He had been left on the periphery in the same sort of way, if for different reasons. In New York, his family connections had not been good enough to get him the job he wanted, even if he was good enough to have that job. For Cathy, her beautiful face and trailing skirts were having exactly the same effect. However, he was absolutely certain that she wouldn't have summoned up the courage to walk into a newspaper office full of men just to ask for the job she had now. The whole thing had made him feel extremely awkward when he had been briefly introduced to her the week before. He didn't want to see the disappointment in her eyes as he welcomed her into her new role as the culinary columnist, and so he had done a very good impression of a man in a hurry. A man throwing on his coat as he walked, not having a moment to spare. It had worked, for he had smiled and welcomed her and kept moving. But it wouldn't work forever, he was sure of it. Even as he studied her in that little slice of space between the blinds, he could see that Cathy wouldn't be so easily pigeonholed forever. She sat straight-backed as she worked, peering about the office from time to time rather openly. She occupied space as if she had every right to be there, and Russell had to admit to himself that he admired her already. No doubt she would be even more impressive when she was finally given the opportunity to speak. But Russell was the boss here, and he wanted his time at the Colorado Tribune to have a certain flow to it. He was certain that upsetting his deputy editor by overriding his decision to place Miss Meadows in a very typical role would interrupt that flow. He was new here, he was still settling in, and the time for making such sweeping decisions had not yet come. Russell rose from his seat and walked across the room, finally closing the blind completely before returning to his desk. He would do much better to concentrate on the work in front of him rather than concerning himself with the career aspirations of a young woman he knew nothing about. And as for upsetting his staff, perhaps that would be something he would be better not to attempt. To upset them all for the sake of one would make his job there very difficult indeed, he was sure of it. But wasn't that the way that he had been treated all along? A man from an impoverished part of New York having his fire slowly extinguished by the complacency of those around him? He sighed and sat down heavily on his chair. Work first, meandering thoughts later. Chapter 3. Cathy rode her horse slowly through town with an expression on her face that could have soured milk. John Alexander had decided that she should write a column on hard times recipes. The sort of thing that might appeal to people who were down on their luck and yet, miraculously, could find a few pennies with which to buy the Colorado Tribune. She huffed loudly and shook her head, knowing that she was being a little cynical, but annoyed with Mr. Alexander's interference. She'd taken it personally, thinking that she was not only not good enough for a proper reporter's role, but now she was not good enough to come up with her own ideas for a cookery column. Even though she tried to keep her mother's advice in mind, she found it hard to concentrate on the idea of an opportunity floating past her very eyes when her pride kept rising up to blind her. Picking through the streets, she finally found the home of Nelda Baines. It was a larger than expected house on the edge of Grafton Crest, sitting a little back from the start of the road out to Mayfield. It certainly did seem like a large house for somebody who had a whole heap of hearty recipes to be cooked up on a budget, until she looked a little closer. The timber of the house was painted a pretty pale blue, but it was cracked and peeling. It looked fine enough from the road, but, as soon as she drew closer, Cathy could see the years of neglect. The white window frames, which must have looked so fine against the blue when they had been freshly painted, were peeling badly, revealing the dry, gray-looking wood beneath. The garden was neat and tidy, with apple trees and other long-established shrubbery having been very well kept. It was the sign of somebody who was doing their absolute best with what they had, and suddenly Cathy felt very sad. She climbed down from her horse and tethered him to the fence. Giving him a quick pat, she wandered along the meandering pathway through the pretty garden to the faded house beyond. Already she had forgotten her own anger and cynicism as her instincts for finding the truth came to the fore. What on earth had happened to this household that they had begun so well and ended so sadly? Miss Meadows? Cathy looked up to see a woman no older than her elder sister, Jane, standing in the doorway. She had been so engrossed in the neat little garden and her feelings of sadness that she hadn't even heard the door open. And the woman, who must surely be Miss Nelda Baines, looked every bit as faded as the house did. Cathy was sure she was not yet 40, but everything about this woman was a world apart from her sister, Jane. Jane lived well and had a vibrant and lively air to her. Why wouldn't she? Despite the struggles of years gone by, Jane was married to a wonderful man, a successful attorney who provided well for her and their children. She wondered then what Nelda Baines' story was, why it was she seemed so very different from her own sister. Miss Baines? Cathy smiled up brightly as she took the little wooden steps 2 at a time. Yes, but call me Nelda, please. And do come in, Nelda said and stepped back to allow Cathy into her home. The rest of the house reminded her very much of the garden, in that it made Cathy feel sad. There was something about it all which suggested that time had stopped for the Baines family some years before. It was as if something very particular had happened, something which had ended the good life as they knew it. She had the vaguest recollection of the name Baines. It was something her mother had said over the years in connection to that family, but nothing would come to her now as she took her seat in the large but dated sitting room. Nelda was a woman who knew her manners, who knew how to entertain, and she had very quickly settled Cathy in comfort before darting away to the kitchen. It seemed only moments later when she returned with a tray containing a jug of peach tea and 2 glasses. The jug was very fine, certainly lead crystal and undoubtedly Nelda Baines' very best. Perhaps this was the jug she got out for company only, and Cathy found herself wondering just how often Nelda had anybody come to visit. This is a very fine house, Miss Baines. Nelda, I mean, Cathy said and smiled. I was born here, and I will probably see out my life here, she said a little sadly. And I remember a time when everything you see around you was a little newer and a little brighter. I suppose that's why I have this great book filled with cheap recipes, she added with a laugh. Do you live here alone? Cathy couldn't help herself. There was a story here, she could sense it. It was Nelda Baines' story, and she had an instinct that it was well worth hearing. My father passed away just last year. Before that, it was just the 2 of us. And your ma? She passed away when I was a much younger woman, Miss Meadows. I was just 18 when she left us. Cathy, please. I expect your mother passed around about the same time as my father. I mean, I never knew my father, but it has such a terrible effect on a family, doesn't it? Meadows? Nelda said and closed her eyes for a moment in thought. Goodness me, then you would be Meadows' daughter, wouldn't you? The baby who was born after, she trailed off. Yes, that's me. I was born after my father died. Still, I suppose the circumstances are very different. No, actually, not as different as you think. Forgive me, Miss Meadows, Cathy, but everybody in town has always assumed that the stress that the Clayton family put on your father led to his premature death, she said, beginning cautiously as if unsure just how much Cathy knew. Oh, yes, my mother is still certain that it was the awful stress which led to my father's heart attack, Cathy said, suffering the strange feeling that she was the one being interviewed and not the other way around. Well, between us, it was that same stress which killed my mother. The Claytons have so much to answer for in this town. So much which has gone unspoken and unpunished. But your family were different, my dear. Your family stood up to them and refused to be bullied. Nelda looked at Cathy with some admiration. Nelda, what did the Claytons do to you? To your family? Cathy felt a little breathless, and the hair on the back of her neck was standing up. They took everything my father had. He'd built his feed store up from the very bottom, and everybody came to him, everybody. Even your own family got their feed for the ranch from Bain's Animal Feed, she said, and Cathy had a recollection. Yes, she remembered her mother once talking about the Claytons and how they had bought Bain's Animal Feed. It was that which had finally sent the Meadows family further north to buy their supplies, a trip they still made all these years later. I've heard my ma talking about it, Nelda. She always said that Dale Clayton bought Bain's Animal Feed because it would be easier for him to put the prices up and hold people to ransom. He wanted to use it to make life impossible for farmers and ranchers, people whose land he wanted for himself. It was his way of grinding them down, Cathy said. That's exactly what he did. Only my father wouldn't sell to him. He knew what Dale Clayton would use the place for. He knew how he would treat everybody in the town so badly, just for his own gain. He was so determined that Clayton would never get the place, Nelda said and drifted off again. Dale Clayton has a way of getting exactly what he wants. He's done it to so many people, Cathy said, instinctively reaching out to pat Nelda's hand. But it is the way he does it, Cathy. It is the way he goes about it all, which is so awful, so inventive in its cruelty. Cathy swallowed. What did he do to your father? She asked, and every instinct was now telling her that this was the very thing her mother had told her to look out for, to be patient and wait for. Goodness, I have never told anybody of this, Nelda said and turned in her seat to look directly into Cathy's eyes. And if my father had not died, I could not have said it. He was so worried, you see. Worried that everybody would believe the lies that Dale Clayton was prepared to tell, and that, in the end, was how my father was beaten. For something he'd never done, not for anything he ought to have been ashamed of, but because he couldn't bear anybody to think that there was truth to the lie. What lie? Cathy asked, her heart pounding. Dale Clayton was going to tell all of Grafton Crest that my father, my wonderful father, had molested one of his daughters. Chapter 4. For 3 days, Cathy had stayed late in the office, waiting for an opportunity to speak to the boss alone. It had been a most exasperating thing to sit outside, just a few feet from him. To even see him through the blinds at his windows from time to time, and to know that she couldn't possibly approach him while everybody else was there. In a room full of people whose job it was to report, nothing went unnoticed. They would all be wondering why the culinary columnist would have anything at all to say to the boss in private, and it would set tongues wagging. Worst of all, Mr. Alexander would undoubtedly want to know all about it, given that he ought really to be her first port of call in any crisis. On the fourth day, Cathy changed tack. Instead of deciding to stay late, she had decided to go in very, very early. She had no idea of Russell Tapper's habits, but he always seemed to be there by the time she and everybody else arrived to start their day. And so it was that she went into work early, while the sun was still coming up on an early fall morning. Leaving her horse in the paddock that one of the local farmers had set aside for use by the staff of the new newspaper office, she made her way to the front door. With trepidation, she turned the handle and was relieved and excited to find it already unlocked. Somebody was inside, somebody was starting early, and she could only hope and pray that it was Russell Tapper. She walked in through the lobby, through the swinging double doors which lead into the newspaper office itself, and hurriedly made her way to her desk. She set down her bag and pulled out her reporter's notebook, opening it to the page upon which she had begun to write up the story of Nelda Baines. Only when she had the book in her hand did she look up towards Russell's office. Seeing the blinds a little open and the unmistakable figure of the man himself inside, she felt a thrill of excitement. Not only was he inside, but he was looking right back out at her. She would have to go into him now, there would be no backing down. "Come in," he called out in a friendly voice when she tapped nervously at the door. "Good morning, Mr. Tapper. I hope I'm not disturbing you." He nodded. "There's something I'd like to talk to you about," she said, and saw his face fall a little. She wondered what on earth he expected her to say. "I see," he said and leaned forward in his seat, settling his elbows on the desk as he crossed his arms. "It's just that I think I have a story," she began and saw his face change. He looked interested now, rather than watchful and braced. "Tell me," he went on, nodding as he indicated the chair in front of his desk. "I went to see a lady called Nelda Baines yesterday as part of my Hard Times Recipes article," she began and rolled her eyes without even thinking about it. He laughed, and she cleared her throat. "Anyway, we got to talking, and it turns out the Claytons have a lot to answer for. I mean, I know they always have had, but the story Nelda told me was truly awful." She knew her tale was already disjointed. "The Claytons," he said and frowned. "Who are the Claytons?" Cathy tipped her head to one side and looked at him with equal confusion. How on earth had he not heard of the Claytons? Then she realized he'd only been here for a short while. Even so, they were the biggest family in the area in terms of wealth and power. Surely, everybody in the newspaper office knew who the Claytons were. However, his blank stare told her she was wrong. They are the wealthiest and most powerful family in Grafton Crest. Well, for several towns across, I expect. Anyway, they have a very dubious past in this town. They came here the better part of 2 decades ago from New York, and the father, Dale Clayton, set about buying up everything his eyes fell on in this town. And if folk wouldn't sell, there wasn't too low a place he would go to, just to get what he wanted. The thing is, nobody ever talks about it. People do his bidding or give him what he wants because he holds something over them, and it's that very something, that secret, whatever it is, which makes him so successful. Nobody ever talks about it, you see, not even in a crowded newspaper office, apparently, she said and turned into her seat to let her eyes drift about the empty office beyond the blinds. A successful man, indeed, if I've never heard of him. Precisely. He just doesn't make the news at all. The people in this town hate him, truly hate him, but they fear him more, and so nobody steps out of line. There have been very few families who have stood firm against him, and I can tell you that the ones who did, well, they suffered greatly for it. She looked down for a moment, determined not to add her own family's dreadful loss to the whole thing. She wanted to get the story off the ground of her own accord, not by use of a hard luck story. So, Nelda Baines has spoken out, has she? Where everybody else has kept the details of this Dale Clayton's hold over them a secret, she has told you? He was peering at her intently now, and Cathy felt a little awkward under his gaze. She felt as if he were summing her up somehow, trying to discover whether or not there was anything to her, any substance at all. It made it all the more awkward that, close up, she realized that he was a very handsome man for his age. His hair was thick, and a lovely sandy color, and his skin was nicely tanned. His pale blue eyes almost didn't fit somehow, and yet, at the same time, they suited him perfectly. Yes, she has, Cathy said, wanting to hurry things along a little and looking over her shoulder to be sure that Mr. Alexander had not walked into the main office. And are you going to keep it a secret yourself, Miss Meadows? He said and laughed, following her gaze and looking all around the office somewhat nonplussed. I realize I must be very amusing to you, Mr. Tapper, but I have my reasons for being cautious. After all, I'm just the woman who writes the recipes, aren't I? The very reason I came in so early to talk to you about all of this is that there isn't a single person outside of these glass walls who would be prepared to listen. Not just because they think my place is elbow deep in bread flour, but because they're all just too scared of him. Too scared to set down on paper the story that should have been written at any point in the last 20 years. Cathy could hear the firmness in her own voice, and she didn't regret it for a moment. Forgive me, Miss Meadows, I sure didn't mean to mock you. But tell me, what did Nelda Baines say to you? Some years ago, maybe 18 or so, Nelda's father was forced to sell his animal feed store to Dale Clayton. Clayton only wanted it so that he would have some leverage over farmers and ranchers. People whose land he wanted to buy, people he was going to force out by making their everyday supplies unaffordable. When Mr. Baines refused to sell, Clayton enlisted the help of his older daughter, Louisa. She was only 15 or 16 at the time, and she was ready to tell anybody who would listen that poor old Mr. Baines had tried to force himself upon her. Dale Clayton threatened to go to the sheriff and to have the whole town believing that the man they had trusted all these years was a monster. Cathy paused for a moment, searching Russell's face for any sign of a reaction. Surely, nobody would have believed it if he was a good man, he said, but she could tell that he was simply playing devil's advocate. A sparkle in his pale blue eyes told her that he was interested and no mistake. Spoken like a man who has always lived in New York, I suppose, she said and laughed. Give yourself another few months in a small town like this, Mr. Tapper, and you will know that these places are all the same. These places are all there's no smoke without fire kind of places. Why is she telling you all this now if it happened 18 years ago? I take it her father sold the business? He sold the business around about the same time that the stress and worry of Dale Clayton's threats chased Mr. Baines' wife into an early grave. She had some kind of seizure after weeks without proper sleep and the sort of appetite that would barely keep a bird going. Obviously, the connection cannot be proved, but the fact remains that the woman died. Cathy could not help but identify with Nelda, wondering if that woman's mother and Cathy's own father would still be alive today had Dale Clayton chosen to live in any other town in Colorado. Did Mr. Baines confirm all of this? No, he didn't. You asked why Nelda is choosing to speak about it now, Mr. Tapper, and I suppose it is largely because her father died last year. She's had years of holding this in, just as he had, and she watched it wear him away. Watched it peel him down to the bare wood very much like their fine old house. She paused again and looked at him. She'd struck a nerve somewhere, and she decided, on a whim, to read to him a little of what she had written so far. With her notebook open to the appropriate page, she lifted it a little to indicate that she was going to read from it. She cleared her throat and knew that this was her big chance. Her father seemed to fade day after day, just like the paint on the pale blue house. As each year passed, Mr. Baines appeared more and more beaten. Struggling to survive on the pittance he had been paid for the thriving business that he had not only raised from scratch but loved dearly. The same business he had hoped to pass on to his daughter, Nelda, a woman whose lifelong worry and care for her father have finally seen her left alone in the house that continues to grow old without any funds to return it to its former glory. This is the power a lie has over us all. It has the ability to frighten us, to turn our world inside out, to beat us into submission. And that is what it did to my father, and it is something that I know I can never, ever forgive. He was never the same man again after Dale Clayton came into our lives, and I truly believe that that was the moment he began to die. It took him almost 17 years, but I watched him fade day after day, dying bit by bit, moment by moment. Perhaps the time has truly come to say something, to speak out after all, Nelda Baines said as we drank peach tea from fine glasses which had been bought in better times and now were only used for guests. And so, Miss Baines spends her days now tending the small garden. Anne. Thank you, Miss Meadows, Russell said, interrupting before she could finish the whole thing. That poor woman, he went on, surprising Cathy entirely. Yes, that poor woman, Cathy echoed his words. When he'd interrupted her, she had expected it to be because her burgeoning article hadn't resonated with him at all. But it had, she could see it. This was it. This was that opportunity that her mother had told her all about. I'm not promising anything, Miss Meadows, he began. I'm going to make some discreet inquiries first before I make my mind up. Yes, I understand. Cathy began to rise to her feet, not wanting to be seen there at all by any early bird who might come into the main office at any moment. That's good writing, Miss Meadows, he added, almost as an afterthought. But afterthought or not, it made her spirit soar. Chapter 5. The early morning experience with Cathy Meadows had made this day one of those where he felt optimistic about his new life in Grafton Crest. For one thing, she had surpassed all his hastily made expectations tenfold, something which excited him greatly. She wasn't just any old reporter, setting down the cold hard facts, she wrote with head and heart all at once, something he'd always thought of as a gift. And as for investigative journalism, that young woman had walked into a house expecting a few hard times recipes and come out holding tightly to a secret her interviewee had kept for almost 2 decades. He couldn't imagine John Alexander achieving the same. Nonetheless, he knew he had to keep his editor's head firmly on his shoulders and not run headlong into something that might either turn out to be nothing at all, or so baseless that he couldn't print it. I think this coffee's getting worse, not better, John said, pouring himself a slug of the tar-colored liquid from a pot on a little stove in the back room of the office. I find it's better not to think about it. Just drink it down, like medicine, Russell said, and was pleased when John laughed. He really did like John Alexander, even if his little flaws were only too apparent. He was a nice man, a humorous man, and one who listened in that vague sort of way that Russell's grandfather had always employed. Something about the comparison made Russell like him all the more. Ain't that the truth? John said, still chuckling. Tell me, what do you know of this Clayton family? They seem like a big noise in this town. Maybe there's something newsworthy in their past or present? Russell said in a perfectly trained speculative tone of voice. I suppose they are kind of a big noise here. Still, I've always lived in Mayfield myself, and even then, I was gone for a lot of years working at the Tribune office in Denver. Mayfield's not far away though, is it? I mean, to me, it looks like almost part of the same town, Russell said and laughed. Ah, that's because you're from New York, John said and grinned. That was the second time that day that his apparent lack of understanding had been attributed to his hometown. You had family here in Mayfield, didn't you? Folks who stayed on in town even when you drifted away for your work? Russell went on, not wanting to belabor the point too much and excite John's suspicion but knowing he needed to dig just a little bit more. Yes, my father's still alive, and I've got more brothers and sisters than I've ever cared to count. And they never talked much about Dale Clayton and his brood? There are no scandals there, no gossip of any kind? No, not that I've ever heard, John said and shrugged his shoulders before swigging down the coffee and stoically avoiding Russell's eye. There it was, the very thing that Cathy had talked about. It was fear, and he knew it. He didn't know much about John's family in Mayfield, but he was certain that they didn't run any sort of trade or agriculture that Dale Clayton could be interested in. Still, wasn't that the mark of a man who wielded an awful lot of power? People were afraid of him even when they had no reason to be. And those people seemed to include John Alexander. Well, that sure is a shame, John. I don't know, folks always seem to like a good skeleton in the closet over a success story. But maybe a feature about Dale Clayton's rise to fame? I don't know, maybe not, he said and shrugged noncommittally, successfully diverting any suspicion. No skeletons that I know of. But don't worry, Russell, something will come along. The big stories don't all happen in New York, you know, he said and chuckled, clearly relieved that the conversation had come to an end as far as Dale Clayton was concerned. Let's hope, Russell said and laughed, watching John's back as he slowly sauntered away. Perhaps this was the sum total of the discreet inquiries Russell was to make. Perhaps it was all he needed to hear. There were certainly one or two reporters from out of town who'd come to the new branch office to try to make names for themselves, but there were more than enough who were local. Despite working away, Russell considered John Alexander to be local. Not only a local but a reporter with many years' experience who would easily have sniffed out any story surrounding the Clayton family if he had a mind to do it. He couldn't be certain, but Russell was quite confident that the reason John hadn't sniffed out such a story in the past was not that it didn't exist, but because he was afraid to start turning over stones and peering beneath. All in all, it had got his journalistic senses tingling, and he was certain now that there was something in what Cathy had said. Of course, they would need to find more than just Miss Nelda Baines to make a story out of it, but that was the part he loved the best. Russell was an investigative journalist down to his very bones, and he had an idea that this was a story he could do something with. Not as a reporter, but as the branch editor. It would certainly be a feather in his cap to have his office supply a story which would end up as front-page news for a change. Perhaps even the main headline in the Colorado Tribune. And since Cathy Meadows seemed to be the only person who would have the courage to dig deeper, then Cathy was the only person who deserved to write it. He laughed to himself. He'd had a feeling, just by looking at her, that she wouldn't languish long on the culinary column. Chapter 6. The note was sealed and tucked inside her reporter's notebook, the edge of the envelope peeping out tantalizingly from its pages. Cathy looked all around her, wondering if Russell had put the note there and, furthermore, wondering if anybody had seen him do it. With an eye on the room, Cathy surreptitiously opened the note, immediately admiring the neat script. Miss Meadows, I am inclined to discuss this further but suspect that this is something we shall need to talk about in private. There is a diner on the Mayfield Road, which is remote enough, I think. Perhaps you would meet me there on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock? You don't need to respond. I'll be there anyway, and if you decide not to show up, I'll understand. It's an unusual request, but I think this might prove to be an unusual set of circumstances. Sincerely, Russell Tapper. Cathy hurriedly folded the note and stowed it away in her skirt pocket. She looked around the office again to be sure that nobody was watching her. If he'd gone to so much trouble to keep things quiet, Cathy didn't want to ruin it. Saturday couldn't come soon enough for her. She'd continued to work on her article in case Russell wanted to see any progress on it. She worked on it at home, never daring at work to turn to the back of her notebook where she had begun her article. Even her own family were in the dark about it all. There was a time to tell them, but that time had not yet come. They would worry and it all might be premature. If the story never went anywhere, what would be the point in upsetting them? Of course, Cathy didn't know for sure that her family would be worried, she just guessed they would. As far as she could see, they had no cause to worry anymore. They had beaten Dale Clayton and had had not 1 ounce of trouble from him in 16 years. Of course, his last act of purposeful damage had almost taken the life of her sister. When Saturday finally came, Cathy set off early. She told her mother that she was working on something that needed a little extra effort to have it ready in time for the weekly submissions sent to the Denver office. Her mother had accepted it with ease, as far as Cathy could see. And so, she set off on a crisp and bright morning to ride out to the little diner just off the Mayfield Road. Cathy knew where the diner was but had never been inside. It was out of the way and about 20 minutes' ride from the edge of Grafton Crest. Being a little isolated and a little set back from the road, it was predictably empty when she made her way inside. It was a surprisingly clean and bright little place, although there was no sign at all of the waitresses. Perhaps customers so early on in the morning were few and far between. Perhaps customers were few and far between altogether. Miss Meadows, Russell peeped out from the edge of a booth. "Good morning," she said, sliding into the booth to sit opposite him. "It's kind of quiet in here," she continued in a whisper. "It's run as a farm." "This is just a kind of sideline, I guess," he said, and Cathy smiled. Like any good reporter, he'd already found out as much as he needed to know about the place before even ordering his coffee. "What can I get you?" A young woman with a bright smile seemed to appear out of thin air. "Just some coffee for me, please," Cathy smiled back with equal brightness. "Sir," the waitress said, turning her attention to Russell. "Coffee, too, please. And a slice of pie, ma'am." He looked at Cathy. "How about some pie?" "It sure looks good," he cajoled, turning to look over at the counter where a pie sat on a large plate, its pastry shining and glittering with sugar. "All right, I'll take a slice of pie too, please." Cathy laughed and the waitress, still smiling brightly, dashed away to fix their order. "I hope you didn't mind the note and, well, coming all the way out here," Russell began, and Cathy realized that they weren't going to start talking about the story until their food had been brought over and the waitress had disappeared into the ether once more. No, not at all. When the pie and coffee arrived, Cathy realized she was actually hungry. She'd been too excited to eat much before leaving the house that morning, and now the smell of coffee and warm apple pie was making her mouth water. Without waiting for their conversation to begin, Cathy took a large forkful of the pie and closed her eyes to savor the moment. "That good, huh?" Russell said and sounded amused. She replied, and he laughed. Without another word, Russell began to eat his pie also, and the two of them talked of nothing more than how good it was until they were finished. Cathy took a sip of the hot coffee before taking her notebook out of her bag and setting it on the table. She pulled a pencil from her skirt pocket and laid it on top of the notebook, ready to scribble something down if she needed to. "So, you still think there's a story here?" Russell asked, his eyes on the notebook. "I do." "Did you make your discreet inquiries?" Cathy was eager to get started and couldn't hide it. I did. To be honest, they weren't extensive inquiries, but I'm not sure they needed to be. He paused and looked as if he was trying to decide if he should go on. John Alexander is a good man, he began, and she realized immediately that the deputy editor was the extent of Russell's inquiries. But I reckon I understood right away what it was you were trying to tell me the other day. This Dale Clayton does have a hold on this town, maybe even the surrounding towns. I don't know. It struck me as second nature for John to shrug his shoulders and more or less say that everything is just fine. For me, that is the sign of a long-standing corruption. No fault on John's part, no fault on anybody's part except for the man who caused it all, he said, and looked truly regretful to have brought the deputy editor into it at all. I know so many good people in this town, and they are all afraid of him. Who stood up to him? Surely, somebody must have. Only one family that I can think of, but it came at a dreadful personal cost to them. Her mouth went a little dry. What happened? A local man was running one of the most successful ranches in the area, the kind of place that Dale Clayton was very keen to take over almost as soon as he arrived here. Anyway, he badgered the man non-stop, offering him a reasonable price, at first, for the ranch he had no intention of selling. When he declined, Dale Clayton started buying up everything else, raising the prices for this particular ranch until it became almost unworkable. The man was young, only 38, certainly too young to die of a heart attack that the stress of it all brought on him. Obviously, that can't be proven, but as far as I'm concerned, Dale Clayton as good as killed him. That's awful, as you say. I have no doubt at all that such a stress can kill a man, but again, as you say, that can't be proven, he said and sighed. Did he have a family? A wife, 2 daughters, and a son. Oh yes, and a baby on the way. She could feel her cheeks beginning to redden. She didn't want to tell their story, and yet she knew she must. If she was expecting the rest of Grafton Crest to speak up, surely, she must have the courage to do the same. And I suppose they had to sell the ranch to Clayton in the end and he got what he wanted anyway. No, they stood up to him. The oldest daughters worked the ranch themselves, working alongside their father's best friend, a man who went on to marry their mother. It didn't stop Dale Clayton. He went to visit the dead man's wife when she was heavily pregnant and tried to bully her into selling. When she turned him down, his revenge was to buy Bain's animal feed, she said, and raised her eyebrows. Nelda's father's place, he said, and she could see that the pieces were beginning to fall into place for him. That's right. He hiked the prices so high for the ranch that they couldn't pay. In the end, they chose to travel each week far out of town, up north, to buy everything they needed. It was hard work, but they did it, and they were soon turning a profit again. So, they beat him? Not until he began to pay off or blackmail local men into coming up to the ranch in the middle of the night and cause all sorts of damage. They cut gaps in the fencing, and the cattle went missing regularly. It was the slow drip-drip of intimidation which culminated in one of the daughters almost being killed in a barn fire. Whoever was paid to set fire to the barn hadn't checked first to make sure that there was nobody inside. Are you serious? Why, that's a story all on its own, he said, shaking his head from side to side. Who are the family? Do you think they'd be happy to be interviewed, or are they still afraid of what Dale Clayton might do next? To be honest, I think the barn fire frightened Dale Clayton. He doesn't mind chasing somebody into their grave with non-stop intimidation and worries, but he almost got his hands dirty that time. He backed right away from that family and left them alone entirely. That was 16 years ago, the fire, and the family has had no dealings with him since. But who are they? The Meadows, she said, and let the revelation sink in. The meadows of Wild Meadow Ranch. My family, Mr. Tapper. Your family, he said in such a quiet voice she hardly heard him. So, you're the baby, yes. My father, Cal Meadows, died of a heart attack before I was born. I sure am sorry about that, Miss Meadows. Mr. Tapper, I don't want you to think that this is some kind of personal vendetta. That's not what got me started on all this, truly. When I went to see Nelda Baines about the Hard Times recipes, I was so struck by a kind of sadness when I looked at the house. It's a fine place, you should see it. A lovely big old house, so beautifully built. But it's so neglected now, paint peeling everywhere, probably a leak or two from the roof. But the garden was so well kept. Old apple trees and shrubs that would have been planted so long ago when everything was going well for the Baines family. They stood like a tombstone, a memorial, to what once was. She shook her head from side to side to bring herself out of her maudlin frame of mind. Anyway, speaking to Nelda, I realized that there was more than just my family who had suffered at Dale Clayton's hands. I mean, I knew that he had interfered all over town, that he'd bought places up, but I hadn't realized just how far he'd stooped to get what he wanted. It makes me wonder how many more people are keeping secrets that should never have been, secrets made out of the most awful lies. Russell sat quietly, not speaking for several moments as he contemplated everything she had said. He peered down into his coffee, and she wondered if he believed her when she said it was not personal. After all, how could it not be personal? It might not be the main aim for her, but of course it was there. Of course, she wanted the town to finally stand up, shoulder to shoulder, and reject that awful man, the man who had caused her family so much pain and distress. But if Russell sensed any of this, would it be enough for him to put a stop to the story before it had even begun? All right, Miss Meadows, he began, raising his head and looking directly into her eyes. It's yours. The story is yours to investigate and yours to write. There are only two conditions, he finished, clearly waiting for her to ask. Yes? What are the conditions? She asked, her heart pounding with excitement now. Firstly, you keep it to yourself. We're going to need to be very careful, not just in the office, but around town. I think this is the kind of story that we need to have everything in place before anybody else gets to hear of it. It strikes me that Dale Clayton has the resources to stamp all over the story before it sees the light of day, so it needs to be absolutely secret. Of course. What's the second condition? She asked, keen to know what limitations might be placed upon her. That we'll work together on it. It's your story, Miss Meadows, and I think you will do a fine job of it. If and when it goes to print, it will do so with your name on it. But I have a responsibility to keep you safe, and so you run everything past me and, if I feel a need for it, I'll accompany you, no arguments. No arguments, Mr. Tapper, she said, a bright smile on her face. Then we have a deal, he said and reached a hand across the table for her to shake. His hand was large and warm, and Cathy could have held on to it all day. Yes, we have a deal. Chapter 7. Aren't you supposed to be at work, honey? You're not normally home so soon, Charlotte Martin said. Cathy had finished early that day, telling Russell that she wanted to work on something away from the office. Assuring him that she would be quite safe, he let her go without argument. The truth was that she had wanted to speak to her mother, but only when the rest of the family was out of the house. Garth, Elsie, and Tex would be out on the ranch as they always were. Tex and Elsie's 2 children would still be at school, and her mother would be alone in the house, finishing up the last of her household chores before turning her attention to the evening meal. I wanted to speak to you about something is all, Ma, Cathy said, wandering up onto the porch where her mother sat on the seat. Well, go on into the kitchen first and get yourself a glass of peach tea. There's a jug on the kitchen table, honey. I'm not sure I like the idea of you appearing so suddenly and finding me sitting here doing nothing, her mother laughed. Cathy did as her mother instructed and went into the kitchen, filling herself a glass from the jug and making her way back outside. So, what's troubling you? Charlotte asked in her wonderfully soothing way as Cathy settled down by her side. Nothing is really troubling me, Ma, apart from the fact that I'm going to have to ask you to keep a secret from me, Cathy said and twisted in her seat to look at her full in the face. Of course, I'll keep a secret for you, you know I will. From everybody, Ma. Even from Daddy, she said, always referring to Garth Martin as her father. He was, after all, the only father she had ever known. And most certainly from Elsie. You know what she's like. I do, Cathy. You know, it's going to be hard for me to promise all of this without having some idea what's going on in your life. I don't want to swear to you that I'll keep this secret if I think it's something that's going to harm you, something your daddy needs to know about. I don't want to lie to you, my precious girl, Charlotte said and smiled, reaching out to lay a hand on the side of Cathy's face. It's about a story I'm writing for the newspaper. Not a cookery story, but a real one. Cathy chose her words very carefully. You know that opportunity you told me to keep my eyes open for? I knew it would come, Cathy. Didn't I say? Charlotte looked suitably proud. You did say, Ma. So why the long face and the secrecy? Because I don't think you're going to like it. Just tell me. With the help of the editor, Mr. Tapper, I'm going to write a piece about Dale Clayton, she said, waiting for her mother's horrified reaction. When it didn't come, Cathy continued. Ma? What do you think? I don't know yet, honey. What sort of story? I mean, the whole town knows what happened here at Wild Meadow, don't they? They all suspect, the same as we do, that it was Clayton's bullying and determination which put your daddy in the ground. I'm so sorry to upset you, Ma. No, it's not a story about us. The story is about the whole town, about Grafton Crest and how one man took us over. It wasn't just us, you know that. I was with Nelda Baines last week. She was supposed to let me have a look at her little book of hard times recipes. We just got to talking about things, and it all came out. Cathy felt that stab of sadness once again. What he threatened to do to that family was even worse than what he did to us, Ma. It was so horrible, so cruel, and such a wicked thing. And she suffered in silence all these years, as her father did. And just like the stress and pain of it all killed my first daddy, it sure does look like it killed Mr. Baines' wife too. And we're just two families, Ma. Look at how many other lives have been interrupted or turned upside down in the last 18 years. There will be more secrets out there, more cruelty that needs to be exposed once and for all. What was the secret? What did he do to Seth Baines? He threatened to tell the whole town that Mr. Baines had molested his daughter, Louisa. He didn't, Ma. I mean, I know I didn't know Mr. Baines, but I know he didn't. I could see it in Nelda's eyes. So much pain and humiliation for nothing. I also know that he didn't, honey, Charlotte said and then drew a hand down her face in a kind of gesture of weariness. That Louisa Clayton, she was always a chip off the old block. Why couldn't she have been more like dear little Rose, she went on, referring to the younger Clayton sister who had married into the Meadows family 10 years before. Mr. Tapper and I are working on this in secret. Most of the office would be too scared of Dale to put anything in print or even to admit openly that the man has ever done anything wrong. But it's my name going on this story, Ma, if it ever gets printed. And I am so proud of you, honey. She reached out and took her daughter's free hand. I won't lie, I'm afraid for you also. You know how close Elsie came to getting really hurt, even worse. I know, Ma. Mr. Tapper will only let me keep digging on this story with him at my side. He realized immediately what sort of man Dale Clayton is, just from what I've told him so far, and he's determined to keep me safe. But I was so little when all of this was going on that I don't have enough knowledge. I don't have a starting point, and I need you to help me. How can I help you? Maybe you could have a think about it all. Think about all the people who lost out to the Claytons, even the ones who looked as if they had been happy to sell, just like Mr. Baines. It sure would be a great help to me. It would give me some direction, you see. I know not everybody is going to want to talk about it, but there might be some out there, just like Nelda. Some who've already lost everything and don't see a point in hiding under a rock anymore. I'm sure I can come up with quite a list for you, Cathy. And I'll do just that, I promise. I'll cast my mind back and see what I can find there. And you will keep it quiet? Of course, I will. You know how your daddy worries about things, and there's probably not really anything to worry about at this stage. But you have to understand that that might change and, if it does, I won't be keeping him in the dark. All right, Ma. But Elsie. Don't worry, I'll mind what I say, Charlotte said and laughed. Thank you. Cathy drained the glass of peach tea, determined to do a little more writing on Nelda's story. Not so fast, Charlotte said, holding on to Cathy's arm. You haven't told me anything much about this, Mr. Tapper. What's he like? Well, I can't say I know him that well yet. What I do know of him, I like. I went to meet him on Saturday morning in that tiny little diner on the Mayfield Road. He really listened to everything I had to say, and he was so nice about it. I guess he treated me just like everybody else, not like all I was good for was typing up everybody else's recipes. It was his idea to keep everything secret. He sure is smart, realizing straight away that Dale Clayton would do anything to turn this upside down if he found out the merest thing about it. A smart man indeed if he's caught onto all of this so quickly. And he said that it's your story, did he? He sure did, Ma. He said if this goes into print in the Colorado Tribune, it will have my name on it. He's going to help, but only to keep me safe. Well, maybe not just that. I mean, he's been a big New York reporter for a long time, and I guess there are all sorts of things I can learn from him. I guess you could be right there, honey. Charlotte let go of her daughter's arm finally. He sounds like a fine young man. I hope I meet him one day, she added, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Maybe, Cathy said in a noncommittal voice, wondering why it was she felt a little embarrassed. Chapter 8. Waiting in the diner on the Mayfield Road, Russell realized he was looking forward to seeing Cathy. He checked his pocket watch for the third time, sighing because he was so early. He was glad he'd found this place and even more glad that it always seemed to be so deserted. It wasn't only that he wanted to keep their work on the Clayton story quiet for a while, but he didn't want to set tongues wagging by being seen anywhere in Grafton Crest with the only female reporter on the team. A very young female reporter at that. Good morning, Mr. Tapper, Cathy said, already sliding onto the seat of the booth by the time he'd even realized she was there. They seem like real deep thoughts. Not as deep as you might think, he said and laughed. Coffee and pie? Yes, please. The same waitress who had served them the previous Saturday at the same time came over with her notebook in hand. She gave them a knowing sort of smile, likely thinking the very thing he had hoped to avoid. Perhaps it wasn't such a bright idea to keep meeting Cathy in the same place, however deserted it might be. "We'll have coffee and pie for both of us, please," he said politely, and the waitress nodded. "So, to get straight to it, what were you working on the other day?" he said, deciding to get to the point of things before his mind started wandering. There was a carefree look about Cathy that morning, and she was wearing a dress instead of the neat long skirt, high-necked blouse, and perfectly fitted little jacket she ordinarily wore for work. Today she was wearing a dark blue dress with long sleeves and white petticoats. She looked like any other young woman in a western town and probably 1,000 miles away from anybody's idea of an investigative reporter. With her golden hair tied back in a ponytail and her skin so young and fresh, she looked more like a young woman who ought to be concerning herself with what she'd wear that night to the barn dance, not how she could safely dig up information on just about the most dubious character for miles around. "I actually just went home, Mr. Tapper. And I did work on what I have so far, and the part of the story that concerns Nelda Baines and her family is just about done." There was a look on her face which suggested concern, just a little discomfort. But, she parroted. "There's something else," he said and peered at her across the table. "The problem I have, Mr. Tapper, is that I'm too young to have much memory of what's gone on over the years concerning the Claytons. I know I was supposed to keep everything in absolute secret, but my mother is a mine of information, and she is also very trustworthy." "I see," he said and thought about it for a moment. If nobody else in town was willing to talk, then perhaps they really did need Cathy's mother to steer them in the right direction. "And how does she feel about it?" "She must be worried about you," he said, and realized that the worst thing of all would be for her mother to step in and demand that she back out of the story. He'd come to like her already. He didn't want anything to get in the way of their little collaboration. He knew it was kind of ridiculous, given the huge gap in their ages, but he liked her company. She was bright and fresh, and there was something very appealing about her dogged determination. "She said she was worried, yes, but I told her that we were working on it together. That helped, and she promised to sit down and come up with a list of names, families who have suffered at the hands of Dale Clayton over the years and who might have a deeper story to tell," she said and pushed her open reporter's notebook across the table towards him. He looked down at it and saw 3 names. "It sure was good of your mother to help. Do you know these people?" "Not really. Dale Clayton put them all out of business either before I was born or when I was too young to know what was going on. Mrs. Watson seems like our best lead so far out of these 3. She used to own a little hardware store, a place her husband had built up from scratch. My ma said Mr. Watson died of some long-standing illness, she couldn't quite remember what, and that Mrs. Watson continued to run the hardware store after he'd gone. She'd been on her own for a while by the time the Claytons came into town. It didn't take him very long to get his hands on the hardware store. Since we already know that intimidating a woman isn't beyond the pale for that man, I reckon she would be a good one to ask," she said, a little breathless with the excitement of it all. "Also, Ma says she's a real talker," she added, making him laugh. "That's excellent," he said, nodding and keeping his eyes on the notebook for fear that she would see his admiration. "I'm sorry I didn't stick to our deal exactly, Mr. Tapper," she said as if she had to get it off her chest. "But I'll do everything else right, I promise. Look, the main thing for me is your safety. After that, it's the story. I know I laid down some pretty stringent rules, but you've only broken one of them, and in a really clever way. This is great information, and I dare say you know your own mother much better than I do. Don't be getting down on yourself over it, you've done well." He wasn't entirely sure, but he thought that she blushed just a little. It was so fleeting that he wondered if she really had, although he realized that he wished it to be so. He'd like to have that sort of effect on her, to have his words elicit some sort of response. Her beautiful face and appealing ways aside, Russell knew that he'd never met such a young reporter with so much skill and determination. From a simple hunt for recipes, she had managed to get the beginnings of a story that was likely to make big news in Colorado, if they got it right. He'd worked with all manner of people over the years, mostly men, but a few women, and yet he'd never met anybody who'd come straight out of the gate at such an early age with such a fine aptitude for the job. Sure, much of it was a learned skill, he knew that better than most, but there was an element of character in it, a sort of naturalness that this young woman had in spades. When their pie and coffee arrived, they fell silent for a few minutes, Russell pretending to concentrate on the notebook, reading back over the work she'd already done, and Cathy simply sat in silence, eating her pie and enjoying it. Just as she had done the last time, she closed her eyes with every mouthful. When he watched her do it for the third time, Russell couldn't help but let a little laughter escape. "What?" she said, her eyes flying open as she swallowed down the excellent pastry. "I don't know, I guess I like the way you make a point of enjoying things." "Well, pie at least. If you're eating something you like, you can always taste better if you close your eyes. It's like if you cut off that one sense for a minute, take away everything that comes into view and snares your attention, you can focus better." "Try it," she said, with the wonderful exuberance of youth. With no way to get out of it, Russell just did as she asked. He took a large forkful of the pie and popped it in his mouth, closing his eyes and concentrating on the taste. "Well, it seems you're right," he said with a laugh when he'd finished. "Although, if I tip my head back and close my eyes every time I eat something, it'll take me all day." "You'll just have to be discerning, Mr. Tapper," she said and grinned at him. She was sharp, appealingly so, and gently amusing. He knew it would be a mistake to let this go any further in his mind, for he knew it couldn't exist in reality. She was clever and beautiful, everything that he was attracted to, but that was beside the point. She was also 13 years younger than he was, and this was her first job. Not only that, but he was her boss. His position of authority dictated that he must behave in the right way. If she had any idea of his attraction and felt obliged to him somehow, he'd never forgive himself. And if there was ever a thought which could have cooled the fire for Russell Tapper, that was it. It was time to concentrate on the job, the story. Chapter 9. "I'll let you do the talking, Cathy, at least in the beginning. I'm guessing she's an elderly lady and I reckon they respond a little better to young women." "I'm sure she'll like you too," Cathy said, smiling at him as they made their way down a narrow path which led to the small house belonging to Mrs. Jane Watson. Cathy had called on her the day before to ask if she would be so kind as to sit down and talk with her and Mr. Tapper for a while. Mrs. Watson seemed pleased, and Cathy wondered if she didn't get many visitors. She had quickly ascertained that the dear woman had no children or grandchildren, and it gave her the strongest sense that she was going to feel a little sad again. "Let's play it by ear," Russell said as they approached the front door. Mrs. Watson was no longer a woman who was quick on her feet, being nearer to 70 than 60, and it was a minute or two before the doors finally opened. Russell removed his hat the very moment Mrs. Watson set eyes on him, tipping his head forward a little in respectful greeting. Mrs. Watson's eyes lit up. "What a lovely young man you seem to be, Mr. Tapper," she said and stood back to allow them both to walk in. "A real gentleman," she added. Cathy watched as Russell lent Mrs. Watson his arm as the three of them walked into the sitting room. It certainly was gentlemanly of him, and she knew that it was by no means a pose, it was utterly genuine. Something about it, that instinct for caring, gave her a swirling feeling in her stomach. He was every bit the editor, every bit the boss, so professional in every moment, and yet in this simple act, he had shown himself to be so human. She watched him for a moment as he helped the aging lady into a seat and felt her stomach flip again when he turned and waited for her to be seated before he settled himself down. Why did that all seem to make his thick sandy hair all the more appealing and his tanned face all the more handsome? Cathy shook her head. She was being ridiculous. "Before you sit down, young man, I wonder if you would be so kind as to go out into the kitchen. Before you arrived, I got a little peach tea ready, and everything we need is on a tray on the table." Mrs. Watson smiled at him. "Certainly, Mrs. Watson," he said and hurried away into the kitchen, returning a moment later with the tray. He set it down on the table and Cathy set about pouring them each a drink, not wanting to leave all the work to her boss. Mrs. Watson accepted her drink gratefully, taking a few sips before setting it down on the little table at the side of her chair and looking at them both expectantly. "So, what on earth could I possibly tell two such lovely young reporters? It's had me thinking all night, really, wondering if there's anything of importance left for me to say. Better still, wondering if there really would be anybody who wanted to hear it," she said with a chuckle, although her words gave Cathy that sensation of sadness again. "Mrs. Watson, I don't know if you remember my parents. My mother is Charlotte Martin, or Meadows as she once was. My father was Cal Meadows." Cathy gave Mrs. Watson a moment or two to think about it. "Dear Cal, he was such a nice young man. He was always so polite when he came into the store. My Arnold liked him so much." Still, Arnold was already long gone by the time that Cal, she trailed off, looking over at Cathy sadly. "You poor little thing. You were the baby, weren't you?" she said, not needing to explain any further. "I was the baby, Mrs. Watson. But now I work at the Colorado Tribune, and I have something I'm looking into, a story I want to write, I guess." Cathy could already see that Mrs. Watson had taken to her. "It's Dale Clayton, isn't it?" Mrs. Watson said, surprising them both with her sudden shrewdness. "It is, Mrs. Watson." Cathy's tone was a gentle one, and she held her breath while she waited for Mrs. Watson's response. "Well, it's about time," she said, her face brightening. "I might have known it would be one of the Meadows family who had the guts to do something like this. Bless me, but you always had guts, all of you. If only the whole town had been like you, things would have been very different." "Do you really think so, Mrs. Watson?" Cathy said, deciding to let her choose the direction. She really did have an instinct for such things and knew that they would get so much more out of this adorable old lady if they simply let her talk. She would go where she wanted to and, on the way, she would tell them everything they needed to know. "Oh, I'm sure of it." Everybody seemed to hunker down, wrapping their arms around their own families and turning their backs on everybody else. Not by conscious choice, you understand, but because it is everybody's instinct. It's a bigger problem, of course, when you are one person all on your own with nobody to turn to. "Oh, Mrs. Watson, what happened? How did Clayton get you to sell your hardware store to him?" Cathy asked, beginning to feel somewhat ashamed of their little town. How could they not have known that this dear woman needed help? "Well, I used to run a little hardware store a long time ago. You will be too young to remember it, I expect. Anyway, my Arnold had started the place from nothing. It wasn't much, really, but it kept us well, and my Arnold was proud of it. Oh, and I was so proud of him, really, I was. We were never able to have little ones, you see, and so he didn't think it's so important to have everything, do you understand?" It was just a little business that ticked over and kept us going. Nothing that kept him out of the house or made him toss and turn every night. It was a good life, and I have no complaints really. Mrs. Watson paused for so long that Cathy wondered if she would finish. She cast the briefest look in Russell's direction to find that he was looking over at Mrs. Watson, the kindest smile on his handsome face. He was going to wait, he was going to leave that good long gap for Mrs. Watson to gather herself. Cathy would do the same. Cathy would follow his lead silently. I was sad when he went, of course. We had a good life together, many years, but when the end comes, it never seems like enough. Even if we had both lived to be this age, would have felt I'd lost him too soon. I suppose that's the way of things, she said and smiled at Cathy. As long as the marriage is good, Mrs. Watson. I dare say there are women out there who see things a little differently. Cathy smiled back, and Mrs. Watson roared with laughter. I dare say there are, young lady. What a lovely sense of humor, Mrs. Watson said, turning to Russell for confirmation. When Russell nodded and smiled his agreement, Cathy felt a little flush of pleasure. My Arnold had been gone a year or two before the Claytons blew in from New York, she said, screwing her face up disapprovingly. And they didn't bother me at all, not for a long time. Your family had already had all that heartache, that hounding which put your daddy into an early grave. I really was very sad about that, she said, segueing for a moment. Thank you, Mrs. Watson. That sure is kind of you. I was absolutely safe, you know, until the moment that Dale Clayton bought Hegarty's hardware. You probably don't remember it being called Hegarty's, but it was. I think it's just Grafton Crest Hardware now, isn't it? Yes, that's right, Cathy agreed. Well, it belongs to Dale Clayton. He bought that about 15 years ago, and that's when all the trouble started. He wanted to buy me out, he said, and I refused. Hegarty's had always been the main hardware store in town, but Arnold and I had our little collection of steady customers, loyal folks who always came in for a bag of nails or some twine to tie back their runner beans. I wonder why Dale Clayton saw you as a threat, Cathy said, almost to herself. He didn't ever see me as a threat, my dear. He didn't need the few customers that I had coming to my tiny little store. It's just that ego of his, he has to be the only one. He has to have it all. I reckon he's one of those men who really does think you can take it with you when you go, Cathy said, feeling a twinge of anger that Dale Clayton could ever have done anything to hurt this dear woman. Ain't that the truth, young lady? What did he do, Mrs. Watson? Russell asked, gently inserting himself into the conversation at last. Cathy was glad. While Russell and Mrs. Watson talked, she studied him a little closer. He was such a strong-looking man, lean but muscular. Wearing dark gray trousers and a waistcoat over a white shirt, a matching jacket over the top and a black tie, he looked so professional. And yet he wasn't so fancy, not like Cathy's brother-in-law, David, who was an attorney. There was something just a little looser about Russell's appearance. She supposed the truth was that he looked like a newspaper reporter. But she could also imagine him in a plaid shirt and work trousers on the ranch, sitting on horseback and looking every bit as capable as he did now. Just little bits of damage at first, Mr. Tapper. I reckon the first thing was the sign over the shop, she said, staring vaguely across the room as if she was looking back into the past. Watson's, she said in a whisper. The sign was broken? Russell asked gently. Not broken, just pulled down. I came out of the house and walked along the street to where the store was, and there it was, just lying on the ground. The sign my husband had painted and put up with his own 2 hands. I could see that the bolts were still in place on the wall. Somebody pulled it down, my dear. Quite intentionally, I know it. That must have been very hard for you, Mrs. Watson, Russell went on, his voice somehow soothing Cathy every bit as much as it must have been soothing Mrs. Watson. It upset me so much. It was just the start of things. And in the beginning, I didn't even realize it. I didn't put things together and see that the damage had started almost as soon as I'd turned down Clayton's offer. Well, after the sign, the front door to the store was interfered with, and I had to get a handyman to come out and fix it. A day or two after that, Dale Clayton came back to me, walked right into my kitchen he did, with another offer. Only this time, the offer was a lot lower, and there was something in his eyes I didn't like. I knew then that he was behind the damage, and he knew that I knew. He liked that I knew. What a creature he is, Cathy said under her breath, and Russell looked at her, nodding slowly in agreement. I held out for a little bit longer, hoping that Grafton Crest would come to see him for what he was. The thing is, they already had, hadn't they? What with poor Meadows and all, she drifted again for a moment. Everybody was scared, my dears, and that was the truth. They were all too busy holding on to what they had to look up and see me, I suppose. It was the same with poor Mr. Baines, Mrs. Watson. Dale Clayton was prepared to tell the most wicked lie all around town if that poor man didn't sell the animal feed store to him, Cathy said, wanting to give Mrs. Watson something that might feel like solidarity. It affects poor Nelda to this day. I expect it does. And that poor child is on her own now, Mrs. Watson said with such care that Cathy had to blink hard. Despite everything she had gone through, Mrs. Watson clearly had a great capacity to feel and care for others. In the end, it all got too much for me. He moved from damaging the store to damaging the house. It was always in the middle of the night, and it always made me feel so very afraid and so very alone. Over and again windows were broken, and I don't mind telling you that my heart almost broke free of my chest on each occasion. The door was kicked in, stones thrown at the place. It really is a most awful way to wake up, especially with no man in the house, Mrs. Watson said, tooting and shaking her head disapprovingly. I knew I couldn't live like that and, in the end, I had to give in. The sale of the store was never going to keep me, not at the price he was offering in the end, but my Arnold had always put a little bit away here and there, and I knew there was enough to see me out, to keep me going if I was careful. I really am so sorry about all of it, Mrs. Watson, Cathy said, a little helplessly. There was nothing you could have done about it, my dear. Goodness me, you were a child at the time. But maybe there is something you can do about it now, put things straight, make things right, she said, and, quite surprisingly, that adorable old lady winked at her. I will do everything in my power, Mrs. Watson, Cathy said and smiled. We won't put anything into print, Mrs. Watson, without your final say-so. And you won't be alone, we've got other folks to speak to before we're done. I hope that is all right with you? Russell said, swirling the remnants of his peach tea in the glass. Of course, it is all right with me. I've waited a very long time to have somebody hear me out. The sheriff we had back then was so deep in Clayton's pocket that he didn't let me get to the end of my sentence. Well, I didn't warn him when he went, I can tell you, she said and folded her arms, her face set firmly. It gave Cathy a little hope. There was most certainly life and fight in this old lady yet, and she was relieved to see it. Well, we'll be sure to come back again and tell you how we're getting on, Mrs. Watson. Perhaps, if you don't mind, we might bring Nelda with us. It would be nice for you both to hear about our progress, wouldn't it? Of course, bring her along. The more, the merrier, Mrs. Watson said and smiled brightly, clearly already looking forward to the company. They saw themselves out, Russell assuring Mrs. Watson that they would make their own way out just fine and he would be sure to shut the door properly behind him. They walked back along the narrow pathway in silence, pausing only at the end of it when Russell reached out and took her arm. "So, is bringing Nelda Baines and Mrs. Watson together to make them feel better, or you?" he asked, gentle amusement in his voice. "Hopefully, both," Cathy said truthfully. "Well, it sure was nice of you." He stood for a moment, a little awkwardly now as if he'd only just realized that he'd caught hold of her arm. "Thank you," she said and smiled at him, feeling a little bereft when he finally let go of her. Chapter 10. When Russell made a point of having each and every member of staff into his office for a few minutes the next day, Cathy knew exactly what he was doing. And he really was good at all this secret-keeping too. The staff was over the moon that their new boss was good enough to ask them all individually how they were getting along, especially since the last editor had barely bothered to say good morning to them all. Little did they know that it was likely the only way he could think of to speak to Cathy alone in the office without causing a stir. He left Cathy until the very end, so late that some of the other reporters had already drifted away, heading for home at last. "That sure must have been a long day for you, Mr. Tapper," Cathy said, highly amused as she took the seat across the desk from him. "You don't know the half of it," he laughed and shook his head. "I guess you've realized I wanted a few minutes with you. And please, call me Russell." "Won't that get everyone wondering?" she said, although she liked the idea of them drawing closer. "I meant when we're on our own, like this. If you don't mind, of course." "No, I don't mind." "Russell," she said and grinned. "And call me Cathy." "Cathy," he said and nodded, holding her gaze for just a moment. "I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. I've had an idea for another angle we can look at this from." It struck her that the moment of informality had unsettled him and made him head directly for the firmer ground of work. "Oh, all right. Ask away." She looked over her shoulder to see only two of the typists left, each of them finishing up for the day. "What do you think to the idea of tracking down the man who actually set light to your family's barn 16 years ago? An interview with him could really pile some weight into the story." "I think that's a very good idea," she said, and already was wondering how they could go about it. "He was never found, and we didn't really even suspect anyone. To be honest, it could have been anybody in town, especially if they were being blackmailed." "Would your mother have any ideas?" he asked, and she was pleased that telling her mother hadn't proved to be the death knell of the investigation. "I'll ask her to go through it all with me. I was only 2 when the barn was set alight, so I don't really have any memories of it. I guess by the time I was old enough to understand, the family had stopped talking about it." She paused thoughtfully. "Yes, there'll be something there that will help us, I'm sure." "Good. But I wouldn't want your mother upset by it," he added in a quiet but deep voice. Cathy smiled at him. Whenever he showed caring, it did something to her stomach. It made her want to know more about him. She's a tough lady. She's not the only one. By the following morning, Cathy had a wonderful lead and could hardly wait to get into the office. Avoiding suspicion, she turned up as early as possible, this time arriving so early that the doors were still locked. "Have you been here all night, Cathy?" Russell asked, striding towards her with a grin on his handsome face. "Yes," Cathy said and laughed. "Well, no, I've been here for about 10 minutes. I have something, and it couldn't wait until Saturday," she went on, realizing that she had just assumed they would once again be meeting in secret at the little diner and blushing on account of it. "Right, let's go for a walk," he said, taking her arm. We don't want to risk someone else coming in early." They walked in silence around the back of the Tribune office and down towards the riverbank. Russell looked this way and that as if there might be one of the newspaper employees down there taking an extraordinarily early morning stroll before work. It made Cathy laugh. "I'm not just trying to protect the story," he said, laughing too. "I don't want folk to start talking. If they see us together, they'll come up with their own version of events, and you deserve better than that." Cathy nodded mutely, not knowing quite how she felt about his words. A part of her was a little crestfallen, thinking that perhaps Russell didn't want anybody to think there was something more to their collaboration because he didn't want there to be anything more to it either. Another part of her was glowing a little, realizing that he was determined to protect her in more ways than one. "So, I'm guessing your mother had something interesting to tell you," he said as they began to slowly amble along the riverbank side by side. "She did indeed," Cathy said, returning to herself as she tried to ditch what she assumed to be a burgeoning girlish crush on her boss. Concentrating on work would surely be the best way of achieving that. For weeks and weeks before the barn fire, there was a lot of damage on the ranch. "I think I said before that Clayton sent somebody to cut holes in the fence so that the cattle might escape and what have you. Anyway, what I didn't know was that my sister, Elsie, had caught the man red-handed. His name is Billy Swain, and he's a sad sort of figure, really. Anyway, when Elsie accused him of working with Dale Clayton, he didn't deny it. He was so afraid of Clayton and begged Elsie not to say anything to the sheriff, and so she didn't. So, thwarted at the fencing, did Billy Swain come back and set fire to the barn?" Russell said thoughtfully, his blue eyes alive with possibilities. "No, my mother firmly believes not. Elsie and Tex, her husband, didn't believe it either. You see, Elsie had previously chased after a man in the middle of the night who she'd seen trying to pry open the door of the barn. She'd been on her own little patrols, apparently." Cathy laughed when she saw the look on his face. "My sister, Elsie, is an unusual and brave but kind of foolhardy woman. You'd have to meet her really to appreciate it." "Your mother sure did raise strong women," he said, and the admiration in his eyes made her forget that she felt so crestfallen just a few minutes before. "Well, she is one herself, so I suppose it just rubbed off." Anyway, when Elsie and Tex went out a few nights later and discovered Billy Swain at the fencing, he said that Dale Clayton hadn't paid him, but that he was holding something over him. He wouldn't say what that was, but it was enough to have him come out and commit damage on the ranch of a family he had no quarrel with. And as for the man who had set fire to the barn, Elsie apparently believed it to be the same man she had interrupted that night. He was probably meant to set fire to the barn in the dark when nobody would be around, but when Elsie disrupted him, he had to come back. Perhaps he was somebody who Dale Clayton had a hold on too. And this man, the man Elsie had seen running from the barn in the darkness, was a lot bigger than Billy Swain. Billy is a little man, kind of weak and wiry, and no taller than I am. So, with 16 years having passed, maybe Billy Swain is of a mind to talk, Russell said hopefully. "Moss says that we'd be better off paying him. He's always down on his luck and often to be found loitering down by the saloon bar at night hoping to borrow $1 so that he might go inside. I think if I offer him that $1, he might take it," Cathy said excitedly. "I hope you don't think you're going alone. In fact, I don't think you should go at all. Just describe this Billy Swain to me, and I'll find him," Russell said firmly. "I thought you said this was my story," Cathy said, feeling stung by his words. It is, he said and stopped walking, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. "All right, we'll do it together. I just don't know how your mother is going to feel about you coming out after dark to look for somebody outside the saloon bar." "I could tell her I'm elsewhere," Cathy ventured. No, it has to be the truth. Your mother is being not only helpful, but understanding, and I think we both owe her that much. If it helps, I could speak to her myself, let her know that there's no way I'd ever let anything happen to you. His voice was low and deep again, and it made the hair on the back of Cathy's neck stand up. I think that would help. As soon as she sees how tall and broad you are, it'll put her mind at rest, Cathy said, blushing again at the unintentional compliment she had just bestowed upon him. All right, you just let me know where and when. For now, I think we need to get into the office. I'll go and open up, and you give it a little while before you come in. We're definitely getting somewhere, Cathy, but we still need to be careful. Yes, of course, Cathy said, feeling her emotions swing towards the crestfallen again and wondering why everything was beginning to affect her in this way. As he walked away, Cathy watched him. She knew that she was falling for him as well as she knew that it would do her no good. He was an older man, a sophisticated man from New York, the branch editor of the Colorado Tribune no less. What on earth would he see in a young country girl like her? Chapter 11. Cathy picked the perfect day for her and Russell to speak to her mother. Elsie and Tex had headed north that morning in the covered wagon to go and collect supplies and would be gone until the early evening. Garth had taken one of the ranch hands, Peter, herding cattle to market. He too would be gone for the rest of the day. With Elsie's children at school, mid-morning was a perfect time. Charlotte Martin would be finished with her morning chores and getting ready to settle down for a rest and a glass of peach tea. Cathy had left the office an hour before, telling John Alexander that Nelda Baines had a couple of last-minute recipes to let her have for her article. Mr. Alexander's interest in Cathy's work was so minimal that he would never know the difference, and so she had decided it was a safe bet. As for Russell, he hadn't come into the office at all, telling his deputy editor that he had a little business out of town and wouldn't be in the office at all that day. And so, Cathy had given Russell careful directions that would bring him to the very edge of Wild Meadow Ranch, and the two of them walked up to the ranch house together. As predicted, Charlotte was sitting on the porch taking her mid-morning peach tea. It was a cool day, and she had a pretty woolen shawl around her shoulders. "You're home early, honey," Charlotte said, rising to her feet and smiling at her daughter and the stranger. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, there's nothing to worry about, Ma. This is Mr. Russell Tapper, and I wonder if we could speak to you for a few minutes," Cathy said nervously. "Of course. Well, come inside, it's a little cool out here today." She got to her feet and led them indoors. "Mrs. Martin, it sure is nice to meet you at last," Russell said and held out his hand for her to shake. "And it sure is nice to meet you too, Mr. Tapper," Charlotte responded, taking his hand and shaking it firmly. "So, Dale Clayton, I presume," she said and ushered her daughter and Russell into seats at the kitchen table. "Ma, we're going to have a word with Billy Swain. I think there's a good chance that he might actually know the identity of the man who set fire to the barn all those years ago." Cathy still felt nervous. "Poor Billy, he isn't really a bad man," Charlotte began. "He just lacked a little bit of guidance when he was younger, and it hasn't stood him in good stead. He's never done anything truly serious, but he always runs with the wrong crowd. I guess if anybody knows who the man was, it's him. The only thing is, it means my going out this evening with Mr. Tapper to find him. The only place he goes to of an evening is the saloon bar." "Oh, Cathy, I do wish you wouldn't go in there," Charlotte said and sighed. "Mrs. Martin, we certainly won't be going inside the bar. We would only be looking to see if he was hanging around outside hoping for a little money. If he's already inside, it means he has managed to get hold of $1 or $2 and probably won't be so easy to tempt into talking." "Oh, I see, Charlotte said and grinned. Well, that sure is clever, Mr. Tapper. Yes, if he's in want of a little money, I reckon it would be easier to get him to talk. I just don't want him to get into trouble for what he did all those years ago. I've forgiven him, you see. And from what Cathy has already told me, Dale Clayton could have threatened that poor man with anything all those years ago. Your kindness does you credit, ma'am. I don't want to get him into any trouble either, I only want information. But I've never seen the man, and I wouldn't be able to pick him out, whereas Cathy can. And not only that, but it's Cathy's story and she deserves to be there for every bit of it. I know it's an unusual kind of a thing, I know you'll be worried about her, but I promise to take good care of her, he said, staring resolutely into Charlotte's eyes. If I stopped my girls doing unusual things, Mr. Tapper, we wouldn't be sitting here in this ranch house right now. But you're right, I'll be worried all night until I set eyes on her again, and that's the truth. I would never let anything happen to Cathy, Russell said, and once again the hair on the back of Cathy's neck stood up. This was getting impossible, and she began to heartily wish that she had never entertained her little crush on the boss in the first place. It was going beyond a crush now, it was growing arms and legs and moving around of its own accord. I know you won't, Mr. Tapper. Charlotte rose to her feet from the table and set about making them all a drink. Now, you'll stay for a little peach tea, won't you? That sure is kind of you, Mrs. Martin. Thank you, Russell said respectfully. As Charlotte walked back towards the table with their drinks, she caught her daughter's eyes. Seeing something knowing and mischievous there, Cathy did her best to fight off a blush. Cathy went back to work for the rest of the day, trying hard not to let anyone see her excitement. She gave a very good impression of a reporter working hard on her latest column and was pleased that Mr. Alexander didn't even bother to ask her how her morning had gone with Nelda Baines. He was almost making it too easy for her, but Cathy knew she couldn't let her guard down. And so, she left at the ordinary time, when Mr. Alexander was still in the office. She went directly to the diner, ordering a meal and eating it slowly, passing the time until Russell would walk past the window before carrying on along the road and waiting for her to catch up with him. Even if she hadn't felt so attracted to him, Cathy knew that the whole thing would still have been so exciting to her. This was exactly what she had imagined the life of a reporter to be like: strange hours, waiting in dark corners to get the best of the story. It was everything she had dreamed of, and she hoped that it would bring great benefits for her in the end. For how could she really continue to write up other people's recipes when she'd been involved in a real story? She couldn't even bear to think about it. When she had taken an hour and a half over her meal, garnering a look or two from the impatient waitress, Cathy was relieved to see Russell walk slowly by the window. He peered in for just a second, to be sure that she had seen him, and then kept walking. Cathy hurriedly paid for her food and darted out after him, meeting him just a few steps away in the darkness that was now beginning to draw down. I've had a good look around, and the Tribune office is empty. There are not too many folks about, so let's walk towards the saloon bar together, he said and offered her his arm. As Cathy took his arm, she wondered if he had only offered it because of the dark. Was this just him honoring his promise to her mother to look after her, or was it something more? Once again, she had to remind herself why they were there, and she felt the other excitement begin to take over her, the excitement of a most fulfilling occupation. I wonder if it's a little bit early yet for Billy Swain to be out? Russell said as they neared the saloon bar. No, he's there, Cathy said and chuckled. Where? I can't see anybody. He's hovering just at the side of the building, see? Looks to me like he's waiting to catch sight of somebody worth approaching for money rather than standing outside the door in an obvious way, she said in a whisper. You're very good at assessing a situation, Cathy. It will stand you in good stead in the years to come, believe me, he said, the compliment so unexpected that she blushed anonymously in the darkness. Thank you, she said, accepting the compliment with grace. Do you think we should walk around the back of the saloon bar and then down the side, rather than approaching him from the front? Yes, we don't want to draw any attention to ourselves. Come on, he said, leading her across the road and down behind the building. It was very dark behind the building, with so many trees behind them that it shielded them unhelpfully from the light of the rising moon. He released her arm now and surprised her by taking her hand, holding it firmly and moving a little ahead of her, picking his way through the darkness to ensure that she had an unobstructed path. Cathy had to stop herself, closing her eyes and savoring the moment. He was a man, after all, not an apple pie. And in any case, she didn't want to find herself falling to the ground. They rounded the corner of the building, and the moonlight was theirs once again, although Russell didn't release her hand immediately. They were halfway to Billy before he finally let her go. Billy stood with his back to them, leaning against the side of the building as he waited patiently, watching for someone with a tender heart to come past and take pity on him. Billy? Russell said, and, despite speaking softly, Billy almost jumped out of his skin. Sorry, I sure didn't mean to startle you. Who are you? What do you want? Billy asked, already starting to back away somewhat furtively. Just a few minutes of your time, Billy, that's all, Russell said and held his hands out in front of him in a placating manner. I'd make it worth your while, of course, he went on, reaching into his back pocket and retrieving a battered leather wallet, already beginning to pull some dollar bills free so that Billy might see them. All right, Billy said, instantly at his ease as his eyes strayed to the crisp bills. What do you want? He was already walking towards them, meeting them rather helpfully further away from the street and out of sight. We need to talk to you about the fire 16 years ago at Wild Meadow Ranch, Cathy said gently, smiling at him encouragingly. And don't look like that, Billy, we're not accusing you of anything. Aren't you? He said, taking a step back. No, we're not. I'm not. My name is Cathy Meadows. It was my sister, Elsie, who was trapped in the burning barn that night, and I think you can see already that I don't blame you for it. If anyone was going to blame, it would be me who did the blaming, but I'm not, I'm really not. I just need your help, that's all, she said, continuing to smile at him and relieved when he took a step back towards them again. Because I would never have done anything like that, Miss Meadows. Now, I know that sister of yours found me that night and I don't deny what I was doing there. I didn't deny it to her, and I'm not denying it to you now. But I'll tell you this, I would never put somebody's life in danger. We know that, Billy, Russell said. But we really do need your help. All right, let's see, Billy said, surprising Cathy by not snatching the money immediately or giving them what they wanted. Billy, all we want is the name of the man who set fire to the barn, Cathy began, deciding that honesty was the best policy. Not because we want him punished for it, but because we want to ask him a few questions. And I swear to you now, he'll never know how it was we came to have his name. We would never reveal the name of a source of information, she said, feeling suddenly every bit the professional reporter. You always knew who was at the back of it though, didn't you? I mean, that night when your sister caught me, she knew fine well that it was Dale Clayton who set me to it. Why do you need to find the man who set fire to the barn if you already know in your heart that it was Dale Clayton who made him? He was asking a surprising amount of questions for a man in need of money, and a drink, and Cathy had to silently admit her admiration. Because we think it's time that Dale Clayton was exposed in just the same way that he was always threatening to expose other people. He needs a taste of his own medicine, Billy, and the two of us standing here now in front of you are ready and willing to give him that medicine, Russell said firmly. Billy seemed to like what he was hearing and took another step towards them. Expose is right, and nobody would deserve it more. Expose. Expose, he said, staring off into space a little. Because that's what he threatened to do to me. That's how he got me to agree to cause all that damage at Wild Meadow in the first place. I reckon it would seem fitting to me to have him suffer a little bit of what he promised others. Billy was clearly warming to the theme. Billy, what did he threaten you with all those years ago? Cathy asked, her mouth going dry with anticipation. He threatened me with something I've never done. But who would have believed me back then? The old sheriff hated me, and I was always in trouble with him. But he could never get me for anything big because I never did anything big. But he would have seized on that lie, that's for sure, Billy said, shaking his head bitterly. Cathy had the greatest sense that she knew what was coming. Did it have anything to do with Louisa Clayton? Russell asked, his intervention perfectly timed. Billy's head snapped up, and he stared at them, his eyes wide. I never did it. I never touched that girl. So, I did what he wanted, and he spread the lie anyway, did he? No, he didn't, Cathy said hurriedly. It's just that it's a threat he's made to others. You weren't the first person he used this particular tactic with. I suppose he found something that worked and stuck with it. You mean he threatened other people with exactly the same thing he threatened me with? Well, no wonder everybody kept quiet. I know I did. There's something real clever about that, isn't there? To say something so horrible that you make a whole town go silent. Billy's voice was low and regretful, and his words struck a chord in Cathy. He had summed up the crux of her article in a handful of sentences. You are absolutely right, Billy. And if it turns out that he made exactly the same threat to the man who set fire to the barn at Wild Meadow, then I reckon we're one step closer to making him pay for the wrong he did to so many people, yourself included, Cathy said, silently praying that he would give up the name. Jed Wells, he said so matter-of-factly that Cathy's eyes widened in surprise. That was the man your sister nearly caught by the barn in the middle of the night. Frightened the life out of him, it did, and I suppose that's why he decided to go back and try again at a different time. Only I reckon he didn't even think to check inside, he would have been so scared and panicked. I didn't know him too well, but he was a bit like me. He'd made his mistakes in the past, and the old sheriff would have been all over him. But what I knew of him was enough to know that he wasn't a killer. If you find him, you just remember that, Billy said, and Cathy was struck by Billy's curious moral courage. Where do you think we'll find him, Billy? In Grafton Crest? No, he left just a couple of days after the fire. Reckon it frightened him to his very bones and he didn't want to set eyes on Dale Clayton ever again. All I ever heard was that he went to Horton Plains, but I never had a reason to go there myself, so I couldn't say for sure. Horton Plains? Russell asked, looking quizzically at Cathy. Horton Plains is just 10 miles from here, Cathy replied, feeling that excitement intensify as they grew closer and closer to the truth. Is that all of it? Am I finished here? Billy asked, nodding in the direction of the dollar bills that Russell still held in his hand. Yes, thank you, Billy, Russell said, handing him the bills and taking a few more out of his wallet. We sure are grateful to you, he said, and Billy looked as if all his birthdays had come at once. Thank you, Billy said, hurrying away from them without a word of goodbye, keen to get into the saloon bar and celebrate his unexpected windfall. Well, I guess it looks like we're going on a little trip, Cathy, Russell said, his pale blue eyes looking almost black in the moonlight. "Sure does," Cathy said, already looking forward to it for more reasons than one. Chapter 12. On Saturday morning, they still met at the little diner on the Mayfield Road. Only this time, they met much earlier and did not stop for refreshments. Russell had walked down to the diner from his own home on the other side of Grafton Crest. No mean feat. Cathy, having taken the little wagon that their family used for general errands, had arranged to meet him there. "Nice little wagon," Russell said genuinely. "Just the thing to take us 10 miles to Horton Plains." "Hop in," Cathy said, smiling down at him. He jumped up with ease and sat down beside her, pleased that the wagon was small enough for them to be a little closer than they might ordinarily have been. He felt strangely at peace as they traveled through the chilly early morning, the sun already up, but not yet warm. The idea that they had 10 miles in each direction, 20 long miles to be alone in each other's company, was something that had kept him awake for a good deal of the previous night. Russell knew that he ought not to let his thoughts stray to the bright and eager young reporter, but he could not help it. However much he told himself that it was improper, the editor of a newspaper, an older man, having such designs on a young woman under his authority, it was getting harder and harder not to think about her. "So, we'll try the saloon bar first?" "Or bars. I haven't been to Horton Plains for a long while, and I don't really know the lay of the land. Still, it's not a big place, smaller even than Grafton Crest, so if he is there, we'll find him," she said brightly, driving the horses with an easy grace, just like any rancher's daughter might. "If he is the sort of man who keeps company with Billy Swain and the like, I reckon the saloon bar is the best bet. Mind you, we might have a wait before it opens. In little out-of-the-way places like Horton Plains, sometimes the saloon bar is never closed." Cathy chuckled, and it was a lovely sound. "Well, if it isn't, I guess we just stop for something to eat. Find a diner, maybe," he went on. "We can certainly stop for something to eat, Russell, but I am guessing we'll not need the diner for anything other than coffee." "Just look under the seat," she said, keeping her eyes front and on the road. What he could see of her broad smile and profile was beautiful. It was going to be a very long day if he didn't rein in his feelings. He sighed inwardly at himself before leaning forward to check under the seat. There beneath was a truly enormous parcel, one which he assumed contained food. "You've got a good appetite," he said and laughed heartily. "My ma never lets any of us out of the house without a parcel of food that could choke a horse," Cathy said, laughing too. "But even I couldn't eat this much. It's for the two of us to share, Russell." "Well, that sure is nice of your mother. And kind of nice to leave the house every day with something to eat. She sure is a caring lady, Cathy. I reckon you're really lucky." "I am most certainly lucky, and I'm really grateful for it." She was quiet for a moment, fidgeting a little in her seat, and he had the greatest sense that she had more to say. "So, you have family back in New York, do you?" She sounded almost shy now, an affliction which didn't ordinarily waylay her. "Only a brother now, and we were never close. He is nearly 20 years older than me, so we never really lived under the same roof. I guess it's the growing up together that makes siblings close." "You sure must have been a surprise to your ma," Cathy said in an unguarded way before she clapped a hand over her mouth and turned to him for just a moment, her expression horrified. "Forgive me, Russell, I shouldn't have said that." Despite her apology, he could see her stifling a laugh. "My mother made no secret of the fact that I was just about the last thing she was expecting when she just turned 40. He laughed too, wanting to put her at her ease. "But I guess you were kind of a late baby, huh?" "I was. Jane is 18 years older than me and Elsie 16. And then there's my brother, Joel. I guess he's around 9 years older than me, maybe a little more. And are you close to them, despite the gap? I am, but I suppose it's because they're always at the house. Elsie lives there and always has, of course, and so I suppose I'm closer to her than the others. But Jane is always turning up. Like your brother, I never remembered living with Jane, even though I did when I was a baby. I suppose that's why she always feels like a lovely aunt rather than a sister. And as for Joel, you could throw a stone at his house from ours, so he's always around. That sure does sound nice, a real close family, he said and suddenly felt a little melancholy. So, your parents? She asked gently. Both passed now, I'm afraid. More than 10 years ago now. My father didn't live long after my mother left us. He missed her, she said, and it was a statement, not a question. You're right, he did. They were a real close couple, you know. I guess we look at our parents and expect our own world to be exactly the same. Not in every respect, just the important ones, he said, knowing that he was heading into dangerous waters. Still, my childhood was really good. There wasn't a lot of money to go around, but there was a lot of love. They were very encouraging, especially when I decided to try to earn a living as a reporter. Looks like we've both been lucky, Russell. She turned and smiled at him, her young face full of wisdom that wasn't contrived or anything other than genuine, real. Did the difference in their ages really matter as much as he thought? And did the fact that they worked together at the Colorado Tribune really make things as impossible as he'd first believed? He shook his head in an attempt to come back to his senses. What did any of it matter when the real question was how on earth did he expect such a young and beautiful woman to fall in love with him? He knew he was well kept for his age, but he was still nearing 33, and she was just 18. Russell had tried to keep things businesslike for the rest of the trip, finding himself strangely grateful when they finally arrived in Horton Plains. Cathy had been right, it really was a small place. They dropped down into it from a hill, and the whole town could easily be seen from just a little higher up. Yes, if Jed Wells was in Horton Plains, they most certainly would find him. They rode through the town and found the saloon bar immediately. It had been too much to hope that Jed Wells himself would be loitering outside, just as Billy had been, but at least the bar was already open. Cathy, I'll just go on and see if I can find him. If he's in and wants to talk, we'll be right back out. Whatever happens, I'll be out before you know it. He didn't want to offend her. Sure, Russell. But don't be too long or I'll get to worrying. And be careful, she added and then laughed. Well, it looks like I'm more like my ma than I thought I was. I'll be careful, thank you, he said, finding himself looking right into her eyes once again. He strode confidently into the saloon bar and approached the bartender as his first port of call. The man smiled openly at him, ready to get him a drink. It was strange, in such a small town, for it was Russell's experience that they were ordinarily suspicious of strangers, most particularly inside the secret den-like havens that saloon bars almost always were. What can I get you? The man asked almost warmly. Information, sir, if you have it, Russell began, returning his smile. My name is Russell Tapper, and I'm from out of town, Grafton Crest, to be precise. Anyway, I've come here because I have a little business with a man called Jed Wells. Business that would be to his advantage, I think, he added the last to let the undoubtedly loyal barman know that he meant Jed no harm. I'm Jed Wells, a great big bear of a man sidled up to him, and the barman looked relieved. He hadn't had to give his patron away for good or ill. I have some news for you, Mr. Wells. Well, a little bit of work, I guess. Well-paying work, and I'm told that you are just the man for the job. Do you have a minute to step outside and talk about it?" The last thing Russell wanted to do was sit down at one of the sticky tables and say what he needed to say, with every occupant of the saloon bar listening intently. "Will it take long? Davy has just pulled this drink for me, see?" It was very clear to Russell then that Jed Wells, great bear that he was also a man of little or no education. There was a sort of vulnerability to him, despite his obvious strength, and he was glad that he had put a few extra dollar bills in his wallet. As sorry as he'd felt for Billy Swain, he already knew he was going to feel sorrier for Jed. Jed followed him meekly outside, and Cathy, climbing down from the wagon, was ready to greet the man with a broad and beautiful smile. "Mr. Wells," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Yes, miss?" Jed said uncertainly as he took her hand and shook it gently. "I hope we haven't surprised you too much, and I really don't want to upset you at all, but are we trying to find out about something that happened a long time ago, and we think you can help us." The very moment she stopped speaking, the very moment her words settled into Jed's brain, the man looked uncomfortable. Russell was about to step in when Cathy spoke again. "You don't have to worry about it, Mr. Wells. I know what happened. I haven't come here to cause you any trouble, I swear that to you now," she said, her voice impressively steady and soothing all at once as she reached out and took hold of Jed Wells' hand again, holding it between both of her own and stroking it gently. "I know that Dale Clayton made you do it. That girl. I nearly killed her," he said, and his mighty shoulders slumped. "Oh, Mr. Wells, that girl is my sister, and she is perfectly all right. She is a grown woman now with a family of her own, and I promise you that we don't bear you any ill will at all. In fact, we want to help you. We know that you were bribed somehow, blackmailed even, by Dale Clayton. He did exactly the same thing to others in the town. He even told 2 different men that he would spread a terrible lie about them and his daughter, Louisa Clayton," she went on, still holding on to Jed Wells' hand. Russell had never been more impressed. She had immediately picked up on the man's slowness, his fear, and his general vulnerability. She knew that if she told him of the others, gave him that little bit of encouragement, a lead into his own story, that he would tell it of his own free will and be relieved to do so. What a woman she was. What a reporter. "He did that to me, miss. That's exactly what he did. And I was so scared because I knew he meant it. And that girl of his, Louisa, she was right there with him when he said it. Smiling at me one minute, all sweetness and light. And then she scowled at me and said it was bad of me to touch her in that way and that the whole town would hate me for it. The sheriff hated me, and that Louisa Clayton told me that the man would put me in jail forever. And she was laughing, and so was her daddy. I knew then I couldn't get out of it. I didn't mean for your sister to get hurt, I just didn't look. I should have looked." He looked down at the floor like a child who was about to be scolded. "You couldn't have known, Jed. And in any case, as I said to you, my sister is perfectly healthy. And you mustn't worry anymore, nobody would believe that horrible lie about you. It was a lie that so many of the men in town were threatened with, and now everybody's going to know how cruel and devious Dale Clayton really is," Cathy finished, releasing his hand and reaching out to lift his chin. "It's going to be all right, Jed. How is everybody going to know?" Jed said, staring right into her face, almost as if he'd forgotten Russell was there at all. "Because Mr. Tapper and I are going to tell them. We work for a newspaper, and everybody's going to know all the awful things that Dale Clayton and his family have done over the years. That will stop them doing it to anybody else ever again and maybe even put right some of the wrongs. You're going to put it in the newspaper," he said, seeming strangely impressed. "We certainly are," Russell said, smiling at him. "The Colorado Tribune. Then he'll get what's coming to him. Everyone will know." Jed went on as if he didn't quite believe it. "That's right, everyone will know." Russell nodded. "And you can forget about all of this now, Jed. Get on with your life and never look back, because I can assure you that my family doesn't blame you. You don't have to look over your shoulder, you don't have to worry ever again." Cathy was patting the man's immense upper arm, and Russell no longer bothered to fight his extreme admiration for her. What was the point? "Well, thank you. Thank you both. I'm going to go back inside now and take my drink," Jed said, nodding and beginning to shuffle away. "Wait a minute, Jed. This is for you," Russell said, handing him the folded wad of bills. "What's this for?" Jed said, looking confused. "I didn't really do any work with you, did I?" "We couldn't do this without you, Jed. Without your bravery, we owe you," Russell went on, gently pushing the bills into his hand. "Thank you." Jed looked down at the money, almost as if he couldn't quite believe he was holding so much. "Take care of yourself, Jed," Cathy called after him as he made his way back into the saloon bar, somewhat stunned by the change in his fortunes. For a moment, the two of them just stood there looking at one another, Russell fighting for something to say that wouldn't give away his feelings for her. "That sure was kind of you, Russell, to give him so much money." Cathy was the one to begin the conversation. "He earned it. And you, Cathy, you sure were kind to him too. You put him at ease in a way I could never have done." "You're wonderful, just wonderful," he said and reached out to take her hand. They stood for a moment like that, just inches apart and looking into each other's eyes. This was the moment that he had almost dreaded. It struck him then that she was a young woman, 10 miles from home with a man who was also her boss. In the very moment that he began to lean in with every intention of kissing her, he drew back. He couldn't do this, not now. He couldn't take advantage when he most certainly couldn't be sure that she didn't feel obliged. "Well, that sure was eventful. I guess we ought to start heading back. We've got a long ride ahead of us." He cleared his throat and did what he could to appear normal, quickly helping her up into the wagon and climbing in beside her. "You want me to drive back?" He turned and smiled, pleased when she smiled back. Perhaps it hadn't affected her. Perhaps she hadn't noticed his momentary lapse. "Yes, thank you," she said, seeming every bit herself. Russell just wished he knew exactly how it was she felt. It would certainly make everything so much easier. Chapter 13. Cathy had been full of bright energy all day on Sunday. Despite the fact that she'd hardly slept a wink after their exciting excursion, she had never felt so well. She'd been fidgeting throughout the entire church service, unable to give Reverend Waters the attention she ordinarily gave with ease. All she could do was hope that Sunday hurried up and got on with it to become Monday so that she could see Russell again. Their trip to Horton Plains the day before had been exciting in so many ways. Even though she still had 2 people to interview from her mother's original list, Cathy knew that they already had enough to run the story. They'd talked about it on the way back from Horton Plains, taking it in turns to confirm that they most certainly did have enough, before looking at one another in search of confirmation. Russell had been a little bit quiet for the first few miles back home, and Cathy thought that was probably because he had been about to kiss her. At least she thought he had been. Never having been kissed before, she knew she wasn't entirely sure of all the signs, but as he'd leaned in, her heart had been beating thunderously, and she'd felt afraid and excited all at once. When he straightened up again and quickly helped her up into the wagon, she'd certainly felt a little disappointed. Russell wasn't the only one who was quiet for the first few miles home. for Cathy had spent that time wondering whether or not she had mistaken the whole thing. When Monday morning finally rolled around, Cathy rose early. She wanted to get into the office before anybody else, hoping to have a few minutes alone with Russell before the rest of the staff arrived. It wouldn't seem too out of place. They had a lot to talk about. Cathy needed to get out of the office for the day and interview the last 2 people on the list, just to make sure they had absolutely everything. Perhaps Russell would want to go with her again. He'd been everywhere else with her. So, when she arrived at the front door of the office to find it locked, she was a little disappointed. If Russell didn't hurry, they'd have nothing more than a minute or 2. However, the longer she waited, the more she began to wonder if he'd make it to the office before the first of the early arrivals. When she saw John Alexander striding towards her, whistling as he went, her heart sank. "Good morning, Cathy," he said brightly as he unlocked the office doors. "You're early." "I only just got here, Mr. Alexander," she said and smiled. "Well, let's get inside," he went on as they walked in through the lobby and the swing doors into the office. Cathy immediately looked to the windows of Russell's office, as if she expected to see him there. Although she had realized that he wouldn't be, still, she felt a sense of disappointment. Was he late? She had never known him to be late before, and it was giving her the strangest sense that all was not well. "We're in before the boss," Cathy ventured brightly, hoping that her throwaway comment might elicit an informative response. "Yes and no, I suppose," John said as he began to rifle through papers on his own desk. "Oh." Cathy tried again when it seems that he wasn't going to say any more. "He's not in today. In fact, he's away for a little while now, I guess. Nothing serious, I hope." Cathy fought to keep her emotions to herself, striving for a light and detached tone of voice. "I don't think so. He's not unwell or anything if that's what you mean." John paused for a moment and looked up from his desk. "He's got a meeting in New York, kind of a last-minute thing, I believe. Some old colleague at one of the newspapers he worked for before. Actually, I think it might be the last paper he was at before coming west." He frowned a little as he thought about it. "Yes, I think so. Anyway, what with travel there and back, I suppose it will be another week before we see him again." "Right," Cathy said, not trusting herself to say anything further. She continued to her own desk and began to set out her notebook and make a show of searching through individual papers of recipes that had been sent to her from readers all around Colorado. But they might as well have been upside down for all that she was reading them, for Cathy was simply staring at them, staring through them, unable to take anything in. Russell certainly hadn't said anything about going to New York when she'd seen him on Saturday. They'd spent the whole day together. Surely, he would have said something. "Still, I didn't expect him to be here long," John went on, continuing the conversation when Cathy had thought it finished. No. He was going to be here for a year before going back to New York, but who knows? A year? Why? Cathy said, not bothering now to hide her curiosity. He just needed a place where he could hold an editor's position for a year. I suppose competition is pretty fierce in New York for the best spots and he wanted to give himself an edge. Can't say I blame him. No, I suppose not, Cathy said, feeling suddenly that everything around her was crumbling and turning to dust. So, he's gone about a job, has he? Her mouth was dry, and to Cathy, her voice didn't sound quite like her own. I don't know what he's gone for, he just said it was a meeting with an old colleague. He shrugged and turned back to his papers. For an awful moment, Cathy imagined him never, ever coming back. If he didn't, the story she'd worked so hard on would come to nothing, because nobody in that office but Russell would give her the time of day. If he didn't return, she would be writing out recipes forever. She realized, of course, that that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was that she had fallen in love with Russell. She knew that now. Perhaps it took something like this to bring a person face to face with what it was they really wanted. And what Cathy Meadows really wanted was Russell Tapper. She had admired him for so long, but now she knew that she loved him also. For all the years that she'd never understood such angst, now she had a perfect handle on it. This was just about the worst feeling in the world, and yet she knew she couldn't talk to anybody about it. She couldn't let her tears fall right there in the office, even though her eyes had filled. All she could do was blink them away, staring down blindly at her notes and waiting for the feeling to pass. When she came to the conclusion that feeling would not pass, Cathy thought it better to get out of the office, to do something constructive. "Mr. Alexander, I have a couple of ladies to speak to in town, if that's all right." "Of course, it is," he said and smiled at her. "More recipes?" He feigned interest. "Yes, more recipes," she said, stowing her reporter's notebook back into her bag and rising to her feet. "Well, you have a good day now," he said as if she was drifting away on some enjoyable errand, a visit to the haberdashery or something similar. With or without Russell Tapper, Cathy was going to finish her story. She was going to let that determination, and nothing else, carry her to the end. She wouldn't think about whether or not it would be published now, she would just do her job. And so it was that she set off to interview the last two people left on the list. Chapter 14. It had been a long few days for Russell, and he found he hadn't enjoyed traveling across country the way he ordinarily did. He didn't want to look out of the window of the train or the stagecoach. He didn't want to lose himself in the scenery all around him. He just wanted to get back to Grafton Crest. His business in New York had lasted only a day and a half. It was the travel which was taking the time. He wished he'd been able to leave her a note, something to tell her what was happening. But he'd received his telegram late on Saturday evening, the boy from the telegraph office banging on his door and apologizing, for the telegram ought to have been delivered to him on Friday. For reasons the boy had explained, and Russell hadn't listened to it all, the hastily scribbled card had somehow been left behind in the telegraph office until the boy himself had seen it on Saturday. Not finding Russell at home, he'd been back many times, determined to hand it to him in person for it looked important. Russell had been too busy thinking about his next move to show any sign of displeasure, and the telegram boy had wandered away with an air of relief. In the weeks of working with Cathy, of getting to the bottom of so much on their own, Russell had quite forgotten that he had telegrammed an old friend in New York to see if there was anything he could find out about Dale Clayton and his family. The telegram he'd received from that friend was brief, as they all were, but intimated that there was a person in New York willing to be interviewed, but that they would not be in town for long. Since the telegram had been delayed, Russell had known there and then that he hadn't a moment to lose. He packed immediately, stopping by John Alexander's house in Mayfield on the way to take the first stagecoach of the early morning, the one which would take him to the nearest train station. He hadn't explained the circumstances to John, how could he? The story was too close to its end to be ruined now by the merest chance that John might fearfully give them away to Dale Clayton, or to somebody who knew him. But John, kind man that he was, had immediately offered to drive Russell directly to the station himself, using the family's impressive but small covered wagon and saving him the wait for the stagecoach to set off. Russell had been relieved for the assistance but knew then that there was no opportunity for him to sneak into the Tribune office and leave a note for Cathy somewhere on her desk. There was no way to let her know what was happening or when he would be back. While there was some relief in arriving back at the train station from where he had begun his week-long journey, Russell knew that he still had a wagon ride to come. By the time he reached Grafton Crest, it would be too late in the evening to call upon Cathy at home. And what would her family think of him turning up unannounced late on a Saturday night? It would certainly put Charlotte Martin in an awkward position, since she would end up having to explain to her husband why she hadn't told him anything of the Clayton story. Despite the fact that he knew there was not a thing he could do until the following day, he still felt that sense of urgency. He wanted to see her. He'd missed her so much. He wondered if she'd missed him too, or if she was simply angry with him for disappearing when they had so much work to do. Climbing up into the half-empty wagon and settling down, Russell thought over the events of the last days. His old colleague had been right. It had been worth the journey. While what he had discovered in the interview hadn't really changed anything or added further crimes, as such, it was still probably going to prove a vital part of the overall story, and he knew that Cathy would be pleased to see it. But that wasn't all that had happened in his days away from Grafton Crest. Sitting in the old office which used to be his own, Russell had finally been offered the one job he'd wanted all along. When his old boss, the editor of the New York Post, saw him sitting in conversation with one of the other reporters, he'd given every sign that he was pleased to see him. Telling Russell to call in and see him before he left, he immediately offered him the job of deputy editor, knowing that he himself was soon to retire and Russell would immediately be canonied into the main editor's position. He didn't want to leave the newspaper in just anybody's hands and had always known what a talent Russell Tapper was. Russell had groaned inwardly. Could the man not have said all this to him before he'd gone to all the trouble of moving away, of going to Grafton Crest and working for the Colorado Tribune? Russell had left the man with great thanks and promised to contact him in the next few days with his answer. He could hardly believe that he hadn't agreed to it all straight away. It was everything he'd wanted after all, wasn't it? But as Russell was bumped along in the back of the wagon heading for Grafton Crest, he knew that what he wanted in life had changed. It had changed in just a matter of weeks, and it had changed into something almost unrecognizable. He wanted Cathy. He loved her, he knew he did, and it didn't matter what he was offered in New York. He didn't want to leave her now. And along with this realization came another. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted to leave Grafton Crest and the Colorado Tribune either. His exasperation with the slower pace of his new life had, he realized, evaporated some weeks back. It wasn't necessarily a slower pace. It was a different pace. They were peaks and troughs, and he realized that he'd come to like that. In New York, there had never been time to stop. There were no troughs, only peaks, and stopping to sniff the roses and look at a life outside of his office had never been a real consideration. But here in Grafton Crest, he had an opportunity to have it all. A good job, work he'd always loved, the time for a life and, if he was lucky, time for Cathy Meadows. Of course, it all relied on Cathy. If Cathy didn't want him, Russell knew that he could do no other than take the job in New York. He loved her so much now he couldn't bear to stay there within reaching distance of a woman he could never have if she didn't feel the same way. In so many ways, Cathy had complicated everything. With the story, she was going to inadvertently shake up the office, turn it on its head. And as far as Russell was concerned, he knew that he would never be the same again. What a gentle power she had, but how strong it was. And how he longed to set eyes on her again. Chapter 15. Cathy had missed the majority of Reverend Waters' sermon for the second week running. She was exhausted, spending all week long thinking and wondering about Russell, and not being able to breathe a word of it to anybody had made her more tired than she'd ever felt in her life. She barely slept at night and could hardly concentrate throughout the day. How she'd managed to come up with a column good enough for John Alexander to agree to send with the submissions to the Denver office was beyond her, but she had somehow. Perhaps the head office editor didn't expect much of her either. Perhaps it was just a column that nobody cared about, not even enough to critique it. But she didn't care about that now. She just wished that she could see him again. She sauntered out of the church with her family, listening to the chatter of her niece and nephew and trying to forget about Russell. So, when she saw him in the churchyard waiting, his pale blue eyes strangely bright with excitement, she could hardly believe what she was seeing. Was it really him? Was he standing there in flesh and blood, or was he nothing more than a mental manifestation of her own longing? "Honey, it's Mr. Tapper," her mother whispered in her ear. At that moment, Russell saw her and immediately began to cross the churchyard towards her. He was smiling a little ruefully, like a man who fully expected to be in a little trouble, but she did not care. He was here, he was back. Her fears of never seeing him again rushed out of her with a sensation that she could almost feel. "Mr. Tapper," she said, deciding that she ought to be a little formal in front of her family. In the end, it was only her mother and father she had to introduce him to, for Elsie was already clear across the other side of the churchyard with her brood, in deep conversation with their sister, Jane. "Miss Meadows," he said, staring into her eyes. "This is my mother and father, Charlotte and Garth Martin," Cathy said, careful not to get her mother into any sort of trouble. "It sure is nice to meet you both," Russell said, catching on immediately and falling into line. "You're Cathy's boss, aren't you?" Garth said. "Well, it sure is nice to meet you at last." "Likewise, sir," Russell said respectfully. "I realize it's Sunday, but I have something at the Tribune which needs working on right away. Something we need to submit to the main office in Denver by the early post. I know this is a real imposition, but might I borrow your daughter to help me for the afternoon?" "Of course, you can, Mr. Tapper," Charlotte said gently. "Yes, take her, Mr. Tapper." "Just means more potatoes for me," Garth said, and Cathy was pleased to see Russell laugh. "As long as you don't mind, of course, Miss Meadows?" Russell said, searching her face, she thought, for any sign of annoyance. "Of course, I don't mind," Cathy said, smiling brightly. She had never been more pleased to see anybody in her life. The two of them walked out of the churchyard in silence, ready to make their way across town to the newspaper office. Cathy wanted to speak freely, but they kept coming across townsfolk she knew, people who wanted to stop for a moment and bid her good day. It wasn't until he unlocked the door and let them into the office that they were able to finally speak properly. "I didn't think you were coming back, Russell," she said, relieved to be able to drop the formality at last. "I sure am sorry about the way I left, Cathy. Everything happened so fast, and there wasn't time to safely get a message to you. But it was in connection with our story, you see." "The Claytons?" Cathy said, feeling greatly relieved. At least he wasn't going to be leaving just yet to take a job in New York. "I should have mentioned it weeks ago, but I sent a telegram to one of my old colleagues on the off chance that he might be able to find out something about the Claytons when they lived in New York. Do a little digging, as it were. Anyway, I'd more or less forgotten all about it when I got a telegram on Saturday evening telling me that there was somebody prepared to be interviewed but that they were leaving New York in a matter of days. There wasn't even time for me to get to the office and leave you a note. I'm really sorry about that, Cathy." Don't worry at all," Cathy said, her relief making her magnanimous. "I'm still sorry." He was looking at her quite intently, and Cathy couldn't help but think of that wonderful moment in Horton Plains when she thought he was about to kiss her. "Well, thank you," she said gently, not really knowing how to proceed. "What did you find out? Who was this person you interviewed?" "His name is Harold Swanson, a man who owns several boarding houses in the center of New York. Another self-made man who's worked hard to get what he's got. Let me guess, Dale Clayton wanted it all for himself? The very same, Russell said and laughed. Only it seems like Harold Swanson and his family are a little like yours. He was having none of it, and he fought back. Somehow, he managed to get everybody in the area to stand shoulder to shoulder. You see, by the time the Claytons reached Grafton Crest, they were already well rehearsed in the tale of the oldest daughter being molested. They'd used the same tactic in New York? Yes, exactly the same. But Harold Swanson didn't hide from it. He told everybody exactly the threat that had been made to him. When he did, everybody who'd already lost out or was currently being threatened admitted that they had been subject to the same attempt. Same in every detail. Anyway, it was then that they ran him out of town, threatening him with the law if he didn't go, he said, and led her into his own office. I know it isn't anything new, but I think it adds to the story. It adds to the story, and it adds in a very important way. What are you thinking? I think that it would do the town of Grafton Crest good to read about how the New Yorkers let go of the old secrets and stood shoulder to shoulder until Clayton crumbled and ran for the hills. Russell, I think what you found out in New York is actually the most important part in all of this. I'm glad you went now, she said, accidentally giving away the truth that she hadn't been at all easy with his sudden departure. So, what do you say we write this thing up now? If we spend the rest of the afternoon, we might just have it ready to mail to Denver tomorrow morning. With ease, Russell. Here, I've written up everything. I interviewed the last 2 people on my Ma's list, and they confirmed the same story in every detail. I decided to just get on with it, to get it ready, and now all we need to add is this final piece. You really are something, Cathy Meadows, he said, reaching out to take the notebook she pushed across the desk towards him. Get ready to see your name in print, he added, giving her his most handsome smile. Chapter 16. On Friday morning, the office was a hive of activity by the time Cathy arrived. She'd overslept a little, not falling asleep until an hour before she was due to rise for work. All night she'd wondered if her article would make the Colorado Tribune at all the next day, and if it did, if it would be languishing somewhere beyond page 5. When she walked into the office, and silence fell, everybody turning to look at her, she knew that something big had happened. John Alexander was the first to approach her, sliding off the desk he'd been sitting on. Well, Miss Meadows, you sure are a dark horse, he said, and she began to wonder if he was about to berate her for keeping such a secret. I think it's safe to say you can forget about pies and stews forever after, he added and grinned broadly at her, the rest of the office joining in with a little laughter. You mean they printed it? It's actually in the Colorado Tribune? Cathy said, realizing that everybody must now know how she'd worked on it for weeks. It sure is, Miss Meadows, she heard Russell's voice before she saw him, and waited with bated breath as he pushed his way through the crowd which had gathered around her. He held out that morning's edition of the Colorado Tribune, the paper still being closed, for her story was front-page news. The front page? The lead story? Cathy said as if she couldn't quite believe it. The Rise of the Claytons, by Cathy Meadows, Russell said, reading her headline with pride. I sure would like to be a fly on the wall inside the Clayton residence this morning, John Alexander said, and there was a lightness to him, a lightness to so many of the people in the office. Cathy realized immediately what that lightness was. For the people who were local, this marked the end of 20 years of slow, gnawing worry. They could all let go of the idea now that their families or somebody they knew and cared about might be targeted by the cruelest family who'd ever lived in Colorado. There was a festival atmosphere, and Cathy could hardly believe it. Well, you're absolutely right, John. There's no way this talented young lady is going to be languishing on the culinary column anymore. It's time we gave her a real job, isn't it? It sure is, John said, and Cathy was relieved that there wasn't an ounce of animosity. Perhaps he just realized her talent, or perhaps he really was grateful that this story heralded the end of a dark cloud which had hung over several towns, not just Grafton Crest. Beginning with covering the meeting that is planned in the town barn later today, Russell said, smiling at her, his pale blue eyes resting on her so comfortably. What? Cathy said, laughing. How long did I oversleep? Long enough that this has gone around the town and half of Mayfield like a dose of salts. Everybody's talking about it, Cathy. Everybody wants to meet this afternoon in the town barn to decide what they're going to do next. I guess they're finally going to stand shoulder to shoulder, Cathy said, finishing his sentence. Stand shoulder to shoulder, he said. So, you'd better get yourself some rest, Miss Meadows, because we'll need you bright and fresh in that town barn later today. Folk will have questions, and they'll want to see the woman who made all of this possible. I wonder what they'll do now that they have the truth, Cathy said, wishing that she could just sit down. She was still standing in the middle of the office, everyone gathered around her, and her excitement had spilled over into exhaustion. This was just about the best day of her life so far, and she wished she could just go home and tell her ma all about it. There's already talk of the town taking back what's theirs, John Alexander said. Although, I don't know if that's really possible. Possible or not, all of Colorado will want to read all about it in next Friday's edition. Looks like you've got a busy week ahead of you, Russell said. You look exhausted. Why don't you go on home and I'll meet you at the town barn at 2 o'clock this afternoon? It was as though he'd read her thoughts. Oh, yes, please, Cathy said gratefully. Russell walked her out of the building, over to the paddock where she had, just minutes before, placed her horse. Everything felt so unreal, like a dream come true at last. She began to wonder if she was still asleep in her bed at home, and none of this had happened. Did this really just happen, Russell? She said a little vaguely. You'd better believe it. I never doubted you, not for a minute, he added in that low, deep voice of his. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be on the front page at all this week. Nobody here would have given me the chance that you gave me, Russell, and I'll always be grateful to you for that. I was so scared that I would be sitting on the edge of things forever, never getting to do what it was I always wanted to. Your talent got you here, Cathy, he said, leading her horse out of the paddock for her. But talent dies without opportunity. It was the opportunity you gave me. Without you, I would have been wandering the town looking for recipes forever. Let me help, he said, lifting her up onto her horse unexpectedly. Sorry, you really do look exhausted. I'm guessing you didn't get much sleep last night. He laughed. Hardly any, and then when I finally fell asleep, it really was time to get up. She was so tired and excited all at once that her heart could hardly comprehend the wonderful feel of his hands on her waist as he had lifted her onto her horse. It was almost all too much, to have everything happen just as she had hoped. She really would need some sleep before heading to the town barn, that was sure. Go on with you, before you fall asleep in the saddle, he said, lifting the reins over the horse's head and handing them to her. And I'll see you at the town barn at 2 o'clock, all right? All right, she said, smiling down at him and fighting a strange and sudden urge to tell him that she loved him. Chapter 17. The next couple of weeks seemed to fly by in a whirlwind of activity. The whole town was buzzing with the story of Dale Clayton, and there was a wonderful, light atmosphere as people started to realize it was the beginning of the end for the worst family to have ever moved into Grafton Crest. Cathy had enjoyed every minute of the meeting in the town barn, happily answering questions and pleased to see that Nelda Baines and Mrs. Watson were in the front row of hay bales which had been set out to accommodate as many people as possible. They were side by side, looking almost as close as mother and daughter as they smiled over at her. The people of Grafton Crest came to a consensus very quickly. They decided that they would turn to a little blackmail of their own and truly give Dale Clayton and his dreadful brood a taste of their own medicine. He was to return every single property, business, and patch of land he'd wrongly appropriated over the years. He was to return it without recompense of any kind and without complaint. If he chose not to, then everybody who had ever suffered at his hands, so many more than Cathy had realized in the beginning, was going to march on the new sheriff's office and give every detail of Dale Clayton's extortion and other nefarious activities. Even Billy Swain was in the barn, telling everybody that he would own up to the damage he'd caused if only he could get the opportunity to tell the sheriff that Dale Clayton was behind it. The story in the Colorado Tribune had brought the town together in a way that Cathy had never seen before. It had become what it once was in a time before she was born. For the second week running, Cathy Meadows was the reporter who won the front page of the Tribune. The paper had sold well, with people from far and wide keen to know what was going to happen to the dastardly Dale Clayton. In the days which followed the second publication, Cathy had been busy out in the town, picking up little stories here and there of how people's lives were already improving and what hopes they had for having the old way of things returned to them fully. As for the Meadows family, they talked of nothing else. Every night at the dinner table, the room was full of chatter and excitement, and Joel and Jane had brought their families over to eat day after day. Even Rose, Joel's wife, who had once been a Clayton herself, seemed relieved by it all. Perhaps she was set free by the idea that the family who had treated her so cruelly for years and shunned her for the decade of her marriage to Joel Meadows, might no longer be anywhere near her. And it was on just such an evening, with all the family present, that Russell Tapper appeared at the house unexpectedly. "Come on in, Mr. Tapper," Charlotte said, causing Cathy to look up sharply from the table. "Forgive me, I should have realized that you would be eating. I can come back another." "No, come on in, Mr. Tapper. There's always plenty. My wife always overdoes things when it comes to food." Garth was already on his feet, ushering in his daughter's boss and making room for him at the table. In no time at all, there was a plate in front of him, and Charlotte was serving up some of the very fine meal that the family was enjoying. "Cathy, I just wanted to come and tell you the very latest," Russell said when the furor had died down, and he finally had a chance to speak to her across the table. "Oh, yes," she said with bright excitement. "Dale Clayton has agreed to Grafton Crest's terms," he said, and sat back in his seat to enjoy the stunned silence which reigned supreme over the table. "He's going to give everything back." "Everything?" Cathy said, feeling suddenly a little emotional. Had her work really given so much back? "He's keeping his profits made over the years, obviously. But the businesses, the buildings, everything inside, every bit of land, everything, is going back to the rightful owners. Where the rightful owners have now passed, it is going to their families. Everything is going back to the way it was?" Charlotte said with wonder. "Almost everything," Garth said, and took his wife's hand. "Some of the things that were taken can never come back. Which is why we've always looked to the future, my love," Charlotte responded immediately, smiling at the husband she loved. Cathy felt the most wonderful sensation of life being complete. Or almost complete, for she still wondered if the man who had appeared so suddenly that evening loved her as much as she loved him. When the evening ended, and it was time for Russell to leave, Cathy decided to find out. "Thank you for everything, Mr. and Mrs. Martin. And it was a lovely meal, thank you," he said, tipping his head respectfully in Charlotte's direction. "Don't you be a stranger now, Mr. Tapper," Charlotte responded with a warm smile. That's right, son, there's always room at our table for you, Garth added. I'll walk you out, Russell, Cathy said, and they made their way out of the ranch house. I really am sorry for bursting in on a family meal, Cathy. There's no need. You must realize they were pleased to see you, not to mention pleased to hear the very latest news. And I was pleased to have you there too, she said, knowing that it was now or never. It's all worked out well, hasn't it? It has worked out well, Russell. I guess the only thing left, the only question unanswered, is when you're going back to New York, she said, and he turned sharply to look at her. New York? I'm sorry, it's just something that Mr. Alexander told me the day you disappeared off back to New York. That you were only here for a year to get the editorship under your belt before returning. They were walking down the lane to the gate which would set him back on the road to town. They were away from the house now, in private, alone. I don't want to go back to New York, Cathy. At least I couldn't go before telling you that I love you, he said, stopping at the gate and turning to look at her. And I can't tell you that I love you only to watch you leave, Cathy said, tears already filling her eyes. I thought I couldn't stay, not if you didn't feel the same way. I didn't think I could be here so close to you if I couldn't have you. But now I know I could never leave you, I could never be away from you, whatever happens next. He reached out and took her hands. I love you, Russell. And I love you, Cathy. Then maybe you can kiss me like you were supposed to in Horton Plains, she said with a laugh. Without a word, Russell pulled her into his arms. His kiss was firm and passionate, like a man who had waited for just that moment for a very long time. It made Cathy breathless, and she returned his passion equally. This was a moment she would never forget for the rest of her life. Epilogue. This is a fine turnout, Mrs. Watson said, holding on to Cathy's arm. Let me lean on you, my dear, until I can get to one of the tables and have a seat. Of course, Mrs. Watson, Cathy said, and they slowly began to make their way across the little meadow at the side of the town barn. Although, I must admit, I do like to take the arm of that handsome husband of yours, if I'm completely honest, Mrs. Watson said with a wicked chuckle. So do I, Cathy said, and the two women laughed. It was a summer celebration and, although it hadn't been named, everybody knew that it was entirely to mark the new beginning in Grafton Crest. Dale Clayton and his brood had left months ago and without so much as a goodbye, not that anybody expected it. Nobody knew where they'd gone now, but they certainly wouldn't easily make a home anywhere in Colorado. And with Dale Clayton aging and having been so thwarted, nobody expected that he would have such dreadful opportunities again to make the lives of others miserable. Nelda has thrown herself into all of this, hasn't she? She decorated the entire barn on her own, you know, Mrs. Watson said with what struck Cathy as maternal pride. I'm surprised she's had the time, what with running Bain's animal feed day in day out. But what about you, Mrs. Watson? You still don't want to get back into the hardware business? No, I'm busy enough these days trying to find my dear Nelda a handsome husband. I know I've got the store back and everything inside it, but I think it's time for me to sell it again. Only this time, I'll sell it for a good price. I'm going to enjoy my old age, my dear, every bit of it. I suppose the job of making Nelda's life a good one is going to be a full-time task for you. If anybody can do it, I'm sure it's you, Cathy said, feeling a little emotional as she thought back to the way things had been. Nelda's house had been the first bright moment in the days after the Claytons disappeared. The very first thing that woman did was have the house painted, the same beautiful pale blue, so clean and fresh. This was the beginning of things for Nelda and the beginning of things for so many others in Grafton Crest. Russell and Cathy had married just weeks after their wonderful moment of declaring their love for one another. They both knew that this was it, that there would never be anybody else who could grab the attention of either one of them. The town was so grateful to them that theirs was just about the best attended wedding in the whole history of Grafton Crest. John Alexander had secretly written a little piece for the Tribune, landing the branch editor and his most promising reporter on page 5. "Set me down here, my sweet girl. Here comes some of the ladies. What a fine day we're going to have." Mrs. Watson was referring to the little brood of aging ladies who had come together as friends in the last months. Mrs. Watson's life had certainly opened up since that day Cathy and Russell had called on her, and it made Cathy's heart swell to see it. As she wandered across to the barn, she could see her own family gathered, chattering and laughing as they always did. Her mother, the man she would always think of as her father, her sisters, and her brother. Their assorted children were playing together, their spouses all pleased to see one another. She thought there wasn't a closer family in all of Colorado than hers, and she was so grateful to be a part of it all. Her only wish was that she had, just once, been held by her first daddy, Cal Meadows. "Honey, why are you standing staring into space?" Russell crept up on her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing the back of the neck. "I was just thinking that I wished my daddy could be here to see this. My other daddy, I mean." She knew she sounded wistful, but that was how she felt. "Well, I don't know what you think, but I reckon he's right here. Where else would he be on a day like today?" He turned her to face him. "Do you really think so? It's one of those things I'm really certain of." He'll be looking down now at all of this with a glad heart, smiling and seeing how his town finally came back together and so full of pride for his little baby who made it all possible. "You should be proud of yourself, my love." "I know I'm proud of you," he said and kissed her gently. "And I for one sure am grateful to have such a young and beautiful wife, especially one who is my chief reporter." He kissed her again. "It wasn't just me who made this possible, Russell. Without your belief in me, we wouldn't all be standing here today, celebrating, coming together. I sure am proud of you too. My handsome, slightly older, wonderful husband," she laughed, squealing when he lifted her off her feet and spun her around. "I love you, Cathy Tapper. And I love you, Russell. And I love Grafton Crest." Thank you for listening to this Indiana Wake audiobook. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to Indiana Wake and Friends so you never miss future free audiobooks and new adventures.